97 million years ago, something enormous moved through a world we would barely recognize. It was not the creature you are thinking of right now. It was not the tyrant lizard king that has dominated our movies, our museums, and our imaginations for more than a century. No, this predator came first. It was larger, it was different, and for millions of years it ruled a landscape so vast, so punishing, and so alive that the very ground beneath its feet was constantly shifting. This is the story of Giganotosaurus carolini, the giant southern lizard, a name that most people have never heard, attached to an animal that most people have never considered, belonging to a chapter of Earth's history that most people have never been told. But that chapter is real, and the animal was real, and the world it inhabited was as vivid, as brutal, and as breathtakingly complex as anything our planet has ever produced. We are going to spend the next 2 hours walking through that world. We are going to reconstruct it piece by piece, bone by bone, layer by layer. We are going to meet the scientists who pulled this giant from the rock. We are going to examine its body, its teeth, its skull, its legs, its brain, and what all of those things meant for the world. We are going to place it in its environment, the ancient floodplains of India, and we are going to watch it move through a landscape teeming with life. And we are going to ask the hardest question of all. What does it mean that an animal this powerful, this perfectly built, this dominant, eventually vanished from the face of the earth? Because that is the real story, not just the life of one predator, but the nature of time itself, the nature of power, the nature of adaptation. And the humbling, inescapable truth that nothing, absolutely nothing, lasts forever. Let us begin. The earth is old. That is a statement that most people accept without truly understanding what it means. We say the number, 4.5 billion years. We nod, we move on, but we do not feel it. We cannot feel it. The human mind is not built to comprehend. We struggle with centuries. We lose our grip on millennia. And when someone tells us that the animal we are about to discuss lived 97 million years ago, the number simply floats past us, abstract and untouchable, like a cloud seen from the window of an airplane. Something different. Let us compress all of Earth's history into a single year. January 1st, the planet forms, a molten ball of rock and gas, bombarded by debris, slowly cooling under a sky with no oxygen. Months in our compressed timeline, nothing much happens that we would recognize. Simple somewhere around March. Complex cells do not show up until the fall. Multicellular life, the kind you can actually see, arrive until November. Dinosaurs, they appear on December 13th. The great theropod predators, the lineage that includes both Giganotosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex, they flourish in the final 2 weeks of December. And Giganotosaurus, the animal we are here to discuss, the apex predator of Cretaceous South America, lives and dies in the span of a few hours on December 22nd. Humans, we show up at 11:59 and 56 seconds on December 31st, 4 seconds before midnight. That is the scale we are dealing with. That is how deep into time we must travel to find this animal. And that is why the story matters. Because everything we think we know about the world, every assumption we carry about what is permanent, what is powerful, what is important, all of that dissolves when you confront the true depth of geological time. Giganotosaurus lived in a world that had been evolving for billions of years before it arrived and would continue evolving for nearly 100 million years after it was gone. It was not the first giant predator. It would not be the last. But for a window of time, a window measured in millions of years, which is both impossibly long and cosmically brief, it was the most formidable land predator on Earth, and almost no one knows its name. To understand Giganotosaurus, we first have to understand the world that built it. And to understand that world, we have to go back, not just to the Cretaceous period, but to the deep forces that shaped the planet during that era. 97 million years ago, the Earth looked nothing like it does today. The continents were arranged differently. The climate was different, the atmosphere was different, the oceans were different. If you could somehow travel back in time and stand on the surface of the Cretaceous Earth, you would recognize almost nothing. The plants would be unfamiliar, the animals would be alien, the air itself would feel wrong, hotter, thicker, richer in carbon dioxide, heavier with moisture. Let us start with the continents. Today we live on a world divided into 7 major landmasses, separated by vast oceans. But 97 million years ago, those landmasses were in motion, as they always are, and their arrangement was profoundly different. The supercontinent of Pangaea, which had once united nearly all of Earth's land into a single mass, had been breaking apart for over 100 million years. By the mid-Cretaceous, the fragments were drifting into new positions. South America was still connected to Africa, but only barely. The South Atlantic Ocean was widening year by year, centimeter by centimeter, as tectonic forces pushed the two continents apart. The narrow seaway between them was growing, marine currents were shifting, weather patterns were changing. And on the western edge of South America, the Andes mountain range was beginning to rise, not yet the towering wall of rock we know today, but a growing chain of volcanic peaks and folded sediment that was slowly reshaping the landscape. This is the world where Giganotosaurus evolved, not a static backdrop but a dynamic shifting stage, a world in constant motion. A world where rivers changed course, where floodplains expanded and contracted, where forests gave way to open ground and then reclaimed it. A world shaped by forces so slow that no individual creature could perceive them, yet so powerful that they determined the fate of every species on the planet. The climate of the mid-Cretaceous was dramatically different from what we experience today. There were no polar ice caps. The global average temperature was significantly higher, perhaps 8 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than the present day. The poles, while cooler than the tropics, were temperate enough to support forests. Crocodilian relatives lived above the Antarctic Circle. Dinosaurs roamed lands that are now buried under ice. This warmth was driven by several factors. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were far higher than they are today, perhaps 4 to 6 times higher. Volcanic activity was intense, particularly along the spreading mid-ocean ridges and the subduction zones where tectonic plates collided. These volcanoes pumped enormous quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, trapping heat and maintaining the planet's hothouse conditions. The result was a world with no permanent ice, higher sea levels, and vast shallow seas that flooded the interiors of continents. These epicontinental seas, warm, shallow, teeming with life, were among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They supported enormous populations of marine reptiles, fish, ammonites, and plankton. And on the land around them, the warmth and moisture supported dense vegetation that fed some of the largest herbivores the world has ever seen. This is the context, this is the stage, and now let us narrow our focus to the specific region where Giganotosaurus lived, the ancient floodplains of what is now Patagonia in southern Argentina, Patagonia. The word conjures images of windswept grasslands, snow-capped peaks, and vast empty spaces. And today that is largely what Patagonia is. A rugged, arid, often inhospitable landscape stretching across the southern reaches of the South American continent. But 97 million years ago, this same region was utterly different. The Patagonia of the mid-Cretaceous was warm, it was wet, it was green. The landscape was dominated by broad river systems that snaked across wide floodplains, depositing layer after layer of sediment as they went. These rivers were not small. They were massive, braided waterways, fed by seasonal rains and the early runoff from the growing Andes to the west. They flooded regularly, spreading nutrient-rich mud across the plains, creating a patchwork of wetlands, channels, sandbars, and forested banks. The vegetation was lush but unfamiliar. Plants, angiosperms, were still relative, having begun their explosive diversifications of millions of years earlier. They were present in the mid-Cretaceous landscape, but they did not yet dominate it the way they do today. Instead, they were ruled by conifers, ferns, horsetails, and cycads. Tall Araucarian trees, monkey puzzle tree, formed open forests along the riverbanks. Beneath them, ferns carpeted the ground in dense green layers. In the wetter areas, horsetails grew in thick stands along the edges of pools and slow-moving channels. This was not a jungle. It was not a swamp, it was something in between, a mosaic of habitats, constantly rearranging themselves as the rivers shifted course. In one decade, a particular stretch of ground might be a sandbar. In the next, it might be the bottom of a river channel. In the next, it might be a forested bank. The landscape was alive in a way that went beyond the organisms living on it. The very ground was in motion, shaped by water, wind, and the slow, relentless work of geological time. And it was in this landscape, this dynamic, shifting, water-sculpted world, that the largest land animals in Earth's history lived and died. We need to talk about the herbivores, because you cannot understand a predator without understanding its prey. The body of Giganotosaurus was not shaped by abstract evolutionary forces. It was shaped by the animals it hunted. Its teeth, its skull, its legs, its brain, every aspect of its anatomy was a direct response to the challenge of killing and eating specific kinds of animals. And those animals were extraordinary. The most famous of them was Argentinosaurus. If Giganotosaurus is a name that most people have never heard, Argentinosaurus is a name that some people have encountered, usually in the context of lists of the biggest, the heaviest, the most massive. And Argentinosaurus deserves its place on those lists. This was a titanosaur, a member of the sauropod lineage, the long-necked, long-tailed, four-legged herbivores that are among the most iconic of all dinosaurs. Argentinosaurus took the sauropod body plan to an extreme that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Estimates of its size vary, as they always do with animals known only from incomplete fossils. But the best current estimates suggest that Argentinosaurus reached lengths of around 100 feet, perhaps more. Its weight was somewhere in the range of 70 to 100 tons. To put that in perspective, a large modern elephant weighs about 6 tons. Argentinosaurus may have weighed as much as 15 elephants. Think about that, not the number, the reality. An animal the length of a basketball court, weighing as much as a herd of elephants, walking through a Cretaceous floodplain on 4 pillar-like legs, the ground shaking with each step, the vegetation parting before it, the sheer physical presence of the thing, the volume of air it displayed, the sound of its breathing, the deep, resonant vibrations of its footsteps traveling through the earth. This was the prey. This was what Giganotosaurus had to contend with. And this is why Giganotosaurus evolved the way it did. But Argentinosaurus was not alone. The mid-Cretaceous floodplains of Patagonia supported a diverse community of herbivorous dinosaurs. There were other titanosaurs, Endosaurus, for example, another large sauropod that shared the landscape with Argentinosaurus. There were smaller herbivores too, ornithopods and other plant eaters that occupied different ecological niches, feeding on different plants at different heights, moving in different patterns across the landscape. And then there were the other predators. Giganotosaurus was the largest, but it was not the only carnivore in the ecosystem. Medium-sized theropods, smaller hunters, scavengers, and opportunists all shared the landscape. The ecosystem was a web, complex, interconnected, and balanced in only beginning to understand. But at the top of that web, at the very pinnacle of the food chain, stood Giganotosaurus. And to understand why it stood there, we need to look at its body. Let us begin with the skull, because the skull tells us more about a predatory dinosaur than almost any other part of its body. The skull houses the brain, the sensory organs, and predator, the shape of the skull, the size of the jaw muscles, the arrangement of the teeth. All of these things are direct indicators of how the animal fed. And the skull of Giganotosaurus is enormous, feet long, skulls of any in the fossil record. Larger, in fact, than the skull of Tyrannosaurus rex, which typically measured about 5 feet. This is a significant difference, and it tells us something important about strategy. But size alone is not the whole story. What matters more is the shape. And the skull of Giganotosaurus was shaped very differently from the skull of Tyrannosaurus rex. The T-Rex skull was built for power. It was deep. It was wide. Bones were thick and heavily reinforced, designed to withstand enormous forces. The jaw muscles were massive, among the most powerful of any land animal that has ever lived. When it jaws, it generated a bite force that could crush bone, literally crush it. Paleontologists have found T-Rex tooth marks punched through solid bone, through the thick, dense cortical bone of other dinosaurs. No other predator in the fossil record has demonstrated this ability. The T-Rex skull was, in essence, a biological vice, a machine built to clamp Troy. The Giganotosaurus skull was different. It was long, yes. It was large, yes. More elongated, less heavily reinforced. The jaws were not in the same league as those of T-Rex, significantly lower, third to half of what T-Rex could generate. Does this mean Giganotosaurus was a letter? Absolutely not. It means it was a different kind of predator. It means it had a different strategy. And that's most clearly by the teeth. Giganotosaurus were blade-like, pressed, flattened from side to side, and running along both edges, front and back. They were designed to cut, to slice, to open wounds. Imagine a row of steak knives, each long, set into a jaw from tip to snout. That is what the mouth of Giganotosaurus. When it struck, it did not clamp down and hold on. It slashed. It opened long, deep wounds in the flesh of its prey, and then it pulled back. It was not trying to crush bone. It was trying to cause massive tissue damage, massive blood loss, massive trauma. This is a hunting strategy that we see in some modern predators, though on a much smaller scale. Komodo dragons, for example, use a slashing bite to inflict wounds on prey animals much larger than themselves, and then they follow the injured animal, waiting for blood loss and infection to weaken it. Sharks use a similar approach, a powerful bite that removes a chunk of flesh, followed by a retreat, followed by another attack once the prey is weakened. Giganotosaurus comparable strategy. A single bite from those serrated, blade-like teeth would have opened a wound perhaps 2 or 3 feet long in the flank of a large sauropod. Blood would have poured from the wound, muscle tissue would have been severed, the prey animal would have been weakened, slowed, compromised, and then Giganotosaurus would have struck again, and again, and again, until the prey was too weakened to defend itself. This is not savagery, this is precision. This is an exquisitely evolved system for converting large, dangerous prey animals into food. Every aspect of the skull, the jaw, and the teeth was optimized for this specific task. Nothing was wasted, nothing was accidental. Every serration on every tooth, every curve of every bone in the skull, every attachment point for every muscle in the jaw, all of it was the product of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, shaped by the relentless pressure of survival. Now let us move beyond the skull and consider the rest of the body. Giganotosaurus was a theropod, a member of the great lineage of bipedal, mostly carnivorous dinosaurs that includes everything from tiny feathered predators the size of a chicken to the towering giants that have captured our imagination for over a century. The overall body plan of Giganotosaurus followed the general theropod template: bipedal locomotion, with the body balanced horizontally over the hips, the long tail acting as a counterweight to the massive skull and torso, and the hind limbs providing all the locomotion. The forelimbs were reduced compared to the body size, shorter than those of many other large theropods, though not as dramatically reduced as any arms of T-Rex. The total body length of Giganotosaurus has been estimated at approximately 40 to 43 feet. That is roughly the length of a school bus. The weight is harder to pin down. Estimates range from 6 to 8 tons, with some researchers suggesting it could have been even heavier. For comparison, the largest T-Rex specimens are estimated at around 40 feet long and 8 to 9 tons. So the two animals were roughly comparable in size, with Giganotosaurus being slightly longer but possibly slightly lighter. But comparing the two animals in terms of raw size misses the point, because they were built differently, they moved differently, they hunted differently. They were as different from each other as a lion is from a wolf, both predators, both effective, but adapted to entirely different strategies and entirely different prey. The hind limbs of Giganotosaurus were powerful but not built for speed. The thigh bone was long and robust, supporting the enormous weight of the animal. The tibia, the shin bone, shorter than in faster-running theropods. This tells us Giganotosaurus was not a pursuit predator. It did not chase down its prey the way a cheetah chases a gazelle. Instead, it moved with a deliberate, steady energy, covering efficiently, burning as few calories tracked and approached its prey. This considered the prey. Argentinosaurus and other large sauropods were not fast animals. They did not need to be. Their defense was their size. An adult Argentinosaurus had virtually no predators. Nothing in the ecosystem could bring down a healthy, full-grown adult through speed or agility alone. The only way to attack such an animal was through patience, persistence, and precision. You approached slowly, you chose your moment, you struck with maximum effect, and then you waited for the wound to do its work. The forelimbs of Giganotosaurus, while smaller than the hind limbs, were not vestigial. They retained 3 functional fingers, each tipped with a curved claw. These arms were muscular and capable of grasping, though their exact function during hunting is debated. Some paleontologists suggest they may have been used to hold onto prey during a bite, while others think they played a role in mating displays, territorial behavior, or other social interactions. The tail was long and muscular, serving primarily as a counterbalance to the massive head and torso. When Giganotosaurus walked, the tail swung gently from side to side, stabilizing the animal and allowing it to make precise adjustments to its balance. When it turned, the tail acted as a rudder, shifting the animal's center of gravity and allowing it to change direction. The overall impression is of an animal that was built for power and endurance, not for speed or agility. A patient predator, a deliberate predator, an animal that knew how to conserve its energy, how to read the landscape, how to wait for the right moment, and then how to deliver a devastating attack with surgical precision. Let us talk about the brain. Because the brain is perhaps the most misunderstood organ in any extinct animal, we cannot directly observe the behavior of a creature that has been dead for 97 million years. We cannot watch it hunt. We cannot watch it interact with other members of its species. We cannot measure its intelligence on any scale that would be meaningful in human terms. But we can examine the endocast, the impression left by the brain on the inside of the skull, and from that we can draw some careful, limited conclusions. The brain of Giganotosaurus was relatively small compared to its body size. This is not unusual for a large theropod or for any large dinosaur for that matter. Brain size does not scale linearly with body size in vertebrates. Larger animals tend to have proportionally smaller brains than smaller animals. This is a well-established pattern in biology, and it holds true across mammals, birds, reptiles, and dinosaurs. The endocast of Giganotosaurus suggests a brain that was elongated and somewhat narrow, with well-developed olfactory lobes, the parts of the brain responsible for processing smell. This is consistent with a predator that relied heavily on scent to track prey across a vast landscape. In a world of shifting river channels and broad floodplains, where prey animals might be miles away and hidden behind vegetation or terrain, a keen sense of smell would have been an invaluable tool. The optic lobes, the parts of the brain responsible for vision, were present but not as dramatically developed as in some other theropods. This suggests that Giganotosaurus had functional vision, perhaps even good vision, but that it was not its primary sense. It was a nose-first predator, relying on olfaction to locate its prey, and then using vision for the final approach and attack. What about hearing? The inner ear structure of Giganotosaurus is not as well known as that of some other theropods, but comparisons with related species suggest that it had a reasonable range of hearing, perhaps tuned to detect low-frequency sounds, the kind of deep, rumbling vibrations that a herd of sauropods would produce as they moved across the floodplain. And what about intelligence? This is a tricky question because intelligence is notoriously difficult to define, even in living animals. We can say that the brain of Giganotosaurus was smaller, relative to its body size, than the brain of Tyrannosaurus rex. The encephalization quotient, a rough measure of brain size relative to body size, was lower in Giganotosaurus. Does this mean it was less intelligent? Perhaps, but intelligence is not a single variable. It is a complex suite of cognitive abilities: problem-solving, spatial awareness, social cognition, memory, learning, and different animals excel at different aspects of it. What we can say is that Giganotosaurus had a brain that was well suited to its lifestyle. It did not need to be a genius. It needed to track prey over long distances. It needed to assess risk. It needed to choose the right moment to attack. And it needed to navigate a complex, ever-changing landscape without wasting energy. Its brain was built for exactly these tasks, no more, no less. We have now examined the body of Giganotosaurus in some detail: the skull, the teeth, the limbs, the tail, the brain. But an animal is more than the sum of its parts. An animal is a living system, integrated and dynamic, moving through a world that presents constant challenges and opportunities. So let us now put the pieces together and ask, what was it like to be Giganotosaurus? How did it move through its world? What did a day in its life look like? We must be careful here. We are entering the realm of informed speculation, the place where science meets imagination, guided by evidence but not constrained by certainty. Everything we say about the behavior of an extinct animal is, to some degree, a hypothesis. But some hypotheses are better supported than others, and the best of them can paint a picture that, while not provably true, is consistent with everything we know. Let us imagine a morning in the mid-Cretaceous. The sun rises over the floodplains of ancient Patagonia. The light is warm and golden, filtered through a thin haze of moisture rising from the rivers. The air is still. The temperature is already warm. This is a world without winter as we know it, a world where even the high latitudes are mild and the tropics are genuinely hot. A Giganotosaurus stands at the edge of a forested riverbank. It is motionless, save for the slow rise and fall of its flanks as it breathes. Its head is raised, nostrils flared, sampling the air. It has been standing like this for several minutes, processing the complex cocktail of scents carried on the morning air. There is the damp, earthy smell of the river, the green, slightly astringent scent of the conifers, the rich, organic odor of decaying vegetation from the floodplain. And somewhere beneath all of that, something else, something warm, something alive, something large. The animal begins to move. Its steps are measured, deliberate. Each foot is placed carefully, the three-toed foot pressing into the soft ground and leaving a deep impression. The ground vibrates slightly with each step, not from the weight of the Giganotosaurus itself, though that is considerable, but from the footsteps of something much heavier, much farther away. The Giganotosaurus follows the scent. It does not hurry. There is no rush. The prey is large and slow, and the predator is patient. It moves through the open woodland, weaving between the trunks of Araucarian trees, stepping over fallen logs, pushing through stands of ferns that brush against its flanks like green curtains. After perhaps an hour of walking, covering maybe 2 or 3 miles, the predator crests a low rise and sees its prey. A herd of sauropods feeding in the open floodplain below. The animals are enormous. Even at this distance, their size is staggering. The adults are like living hills, their long necks sweeping back and forth as they strip vegetation from the treetops. The young are smaller, perhaps only 20 or 30 feet long, but they stay close to the adults, instinctively seeking the protection of the herd. The Giganotosaurus stops. It watches. Its small, sharp eyes scan the herd, assessing. It is looking for weakness, a limp, a lagging individual, a young animal that has strayed too far from the group. It is not going to charge in blindly. It is not going to attack the nearest animal. It is going to choose its target with care, because a mistake here could be fatal. A poorly aimed attack on a healthy adult sauropod could result in a devastating blow from that massive tail, a tail that in an animal like Argentinosaurus was a weapon capable of shattering bone. So the predator waits and watches and calculates. This is the reality of predation in the Cretaceous, not the frenzied, roaring, blood-soaked spectacle of popular imagination, but a slow, deliberate, almost meditative process of assessment and decision-making. Predator cannot afford to waste energy on failed attacks. Every calorie matters, every risk must be weighed against the potential reward, and so the Giganotosaurus watches the herd. It watches for minutes that stretch into hours. It watches the dynamics of the group, which animals are in the center, which are on the periphery. It watches the young animals, are any of them sick, injured, falling behind. It watches the terrain, where are the soft spots in the ground, the places where a heavy animal might stumble. There are the channels, the ditches, the obstacles that might slow a fleeing prey animal or provide cover for an approaching predator. And eventually it sees what it is looking for. A sub-adult sauropod, perhaps 40 feet long, has drifted to the edge of the herd. It is feeding on a low stand of cycads, its long neck stretched out, its attention focused on the food. It is separated from the nearest adult by perhaps 50 yards, not a huge distance, but enough for what the Giganotosaurus needs. The predator begins its approach. It moves slowly, keeping its body low as a 43-foot theropod can get anyway. It uses the scattered trees and the undulations of the terrain to conceal its approach. It is not stealthy in the way a cat is stealthy. It is simply careful, patient, methodical. When it is close enough, perhaps 30 yards from the young sauropod, it accelerates, not to a sprint. Giganotosaurus was not built for sprinting, but to a fast walk, then a trot, then a lumbering run that covers the ground with surprising speed. The earth shakes. The young sauropod lifts its head, alarmed. It turns to flee, but it is too slow. The Giganotosaurus closes the distance in seconds. The strike is precise. The massive head sweeps forward and down, the jaws opening wide, the blade like teeth catching the flank of the young sauropod just behind the shoulder. The bite is not a clamping, crushing bite. It is a slashing bite. The teeth slice through skin, through fat, through the outer layers of muscle, opening a wound that is perhaps 3 feet long and several inches deep. Blood flows immediately, bright red arterial blood pulsing with each heartbeat of the wounded animal. The Giganotosaurus pulls back. It does not hold on. It does not try to wrestle the prey to the ground. It retreats, putting distance between itself and the injured sauropod, which is now bellowing in pain and fear. The adults in the herd have noticed. They are turning, moving toward the disturbance, their massive bodies forming a protective wall around the injured youngster. But the damage is done. The wound is deep and it is bleeding freely. The young sauropod will weaken. Over the next hour or the next several hours it will slow down, its movements will become uncoordinated, its blood pressure will drop, and when it is weak enough, the Giganotosaurus will approach again, and strike again, and again, until the prey collapses. This is the hunting strategy of the slicing predator, not a single overwhelming kill, but a campaign of attrition. A series of calculated strikes, each one weakening the prey a little more until the balance tips irreversibly in the predator's favor. We do not know if this is exactly how it happened. We cannot know. But the evidence, the teeth, the skull, the jaw mechanics, the body proportions, the prey animals available, all point in this direction. This is a hypothesis that fits the data. And it gives us a window into a world that is at once alien and familiar, a world where the fundamental dynamics of predator and prey played out on a scale that dwarfs anything in the modern world. Now we need to pause and address something. We need to talk about how we know any of this, because everything we have discussed so far, the anatomy, the behavior, the ecology, all of it is derived from fossils. And fossils are by their very nature incomplete. They are fragments, snapshots. Pieces of a puzzle that is missing most of its pieces. And the story of how those fragments were found, studied, and interpreted is as remarkable as the story of the animal itself. The discovery of Giganotosaurus carolini is a story that begins not in a university laboratory or a well-funded research institution, but in the arid, windswept badlands of Patagonia in the year 1993. An amateur fossil enthusiast named Ruben Dario Carolini was exploring a dry, eroded landscape near the town of El Chacon in the Neuquén province of Argentina. This region is known to paleontologists as one of the richest dinosaur-bearing formations in the world. The rocks here belong to the Candeleros Formation, a geological unit laid down during the mid-Cretaceous period, approximately 97 to 100 million years ago. These rocks are composed of sandstones, mudstones, and siltstones, the compacted lithified remnants of those ancient river channels and floodplains we described earlier, and they are full of fossils. Carolini was not a professional scientist. He was, depending on the source, a mechanic, an auto parts dealer, or simply a local enthusiast with a passion for fossil hunting. What is not in dispute is that he had a good eye and a lot of patience, two qualities that are essential for finding fossils in the field. What he found that day was a single bone partially exposed on the surface of the eroded rock. It was large, very large, and it was clearly not from any animal that Carolini had seen before. He reported his find to the local museum, and the news quickly reached the professional paleontological community. Two Argentine paleontologists, Rodolfo Coria and Leonardo Salgado, took charge of the excavation. What they uncovered over the following months was extraordinary. The skeleton was approximately 70% complete. For a large dinosaur, this is remarkably good. Most dinosaur specimens are known from far less, sometimes just a few bones, a partial jaw, or a handful of teeth. A 70% complete skeleton is a paleontological treasure. It provides enough material to reconstruct the animal's overall body plan with reasonable confidence, to estimate its size, to analyze its anatomy in detail, and to compare it with related species. The bones were stone, hard, compacted river sand that had been deposited around the carcass 97 million years ago. Extracting them was painstaking work. Each bone had to be carefully exposed, mapped, photographed, and then encased in a protective jacket of plaster and burlap before being removed from the ground. The process took months. The team worked in the harsh Patagonian sun, enduring wind, dust, and the logistical challenges of operating in a remote location. But the result was worth the effort. When the bones were finally cleaned, prepared, and assembled in the laboratory, they revealed an animal that shook the paleontological world. The formal scientific description of Giganotosaurus carolini was published by Coria and Salgado in 1995 in the journal Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. The paper was brief, as formal taxonomic descriptions often are, but its implications were enormous. Coria and Salgado identified the new animal as a member of the Carcharodontosauridae, a family of large theropod dinosaurs that had been poorly understood up to that point. The family takes its name from Spinosaurus, a large predator from North Africa described in the 1920s. It means shark-toothed lizard, a reference to the blade-like serrated teeth that characterize the group. Before the discovery of Giganotosaurus, the Carcharodontosaurus, mainly from fragmentary isolated teeth and scattered bone, group was recognized as a distinct lineage of large theropods, but its full evolutionary significance were not yet. Giganotosaurus changed. Here, for the first time, was a nearly complete skeleton of a Carcharodontosaurid, an animal that could be studied in detail, compared with other theropods, and used to reconstruct the evolutionary history of the group. And what the study revealed was striking. Giganotosaurus was larger than Tyrannosaurus rex, or at least the known specimen was. The skull was longer, the body was longer. The animal was, by at least some measures, the largest terrestrial predator yet discovered. This was news. Big news, the popular press seized on it immediately. Bigger than T-Rex was the headline, repeated in newspapers and magazines around the world. And while the scientific reality was more nuanced than the headlines suggested, the size difference was modest, and the two animals were very different in many ways. The discovery succeeded in doing something important. It reminded the world that Tyrannosaurus rex was not the only giant on the Earth. It was not even the biggest. And it was not the first. Giganotosaurus had lived and died 30 million years before T-Rex even evolved. 30 million years. That is a span of time longer than the entire age of mammals. Longer than the time that separates us from the extinction of the dinosaurs. In 30 million years, entire ecosystems rise and fall. Species evolve, diversify, and go extinct. Continents move, climates shift, the world transforms. And in the world of the mid-Cretaceous, the world of Giganotosaurus, the rules were different. The players were different, the game was different. Giganotosaurus was not a precursor to T-Rex, it was not a prototype, it was not an earlier, less refined version of the same design. It was something else entirely, a different evolutionary solution to the same fundamental challenge of being a large predator in a world of even larger prey. Let us explore that idea further, because it is central to understanding both Giganotosaurus and the broader patterns of evolution. The concept is called convergent evolution, and it is one of the most powerful and illuminating ideas in all of biology. Convergent evolution occurs when two unrelated or distantly related organisms independently evolve similar features in response to similar environmental pressures. The classic example is the wing. Birds, bats, and pterosaurs all evolved wings capable of powered flight, but they evolved them independently from different ancestral structures. A bird's wing is a modified forelimb with feathers. A bat's wing is a modified hand with a skin membrane stretched between elongated fingers. A pterosaur's wing was a skin membrane supported primarily by a single elongated finger. 3 different solutions to the same problem: how to fly. Convergent evolution tells us something profound about the nature of life. It tells us that the physical and ecological challenges of the environment are so powerful, so insistent, so unavoidable, that different lineages of organisms will independently arrive at similar solutions. It tells us that evolution is not random. It is constrained by physics, by chemistry, by the geometry of bodies, and by the demands of the environment. Given a particular set of challenges, there are only so many ways to solve them, and different lineages, starting from different points, will converge on those solutions again and again. This is exactly what happened with Giganotosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex. Both were large theropod predators. Both were apex carnivores at the top of their respective food chains. Both were bipedal, with massive skulls, powerful jaws, and blade or crush-adapted teeth. Both hunted large prey. Both dominated their ecosystems, but they were not closely related. They belonged to different theropod families that had diverged from each other deep in the Jurassic period, perhaps 150 million years. Giganotosaurus was a Carcharodontosaurid, part of a lineage that had its roots in Gondwana, the southern supercontinent that included South America, Africa, India, and Antarctica. Tyrannosaurus was a Tyrannosaurid, part of a lineage that had its roots in Laurasia, the northern supercontinent that included North America, Europe, and Asia. For years, these two lineages evolved independently on different continents and under different environmental pressures. They never competed. They never even occupied the same time, at least not during the period's development. And yet they became giant predators. They both developed massive skulls and powerful jaws. They both became the dominant carnivores of their respective worlds, but the details were different. The how was different. Giganotosaurus evolved slicing teeth and a slashing hunting strategy, adapted to prey on enormous sauropods in a landscape of open floodplains. Tyrannosaurus evolved bone-crushing jaws and a gripping, smashing hunting strategy, adapted to prey on large ceratopsians and hadrosaurs in a landscape of forests and river valleys. 2 different problems, 2 different solutions. Same basic answer: become the biggest, most powerful predator in your world. This is convergent evolution in action, and it tells us something important about the nature of the Giganotosaurus story. This animal was not a footnote in the history of T-Rex. It was not a rough draft. It was its own story, complete and self-contained, played out on its own stage, in its own time, under its own rules. And it was just as successful, just as powerful, and just as perfectly adapted as the more famous tyrant lizard that would follow it 30 million years later. Let us return now to the landscape. Because we have spent considerable time examining the anatomy and evolutionary context of Giganotosaurus, but we have not yet fully explored the ecosystem in which it lived. And that ecosystem is essential to understanding the animal. No predator exists in isolation. Every predator is embedded in a web of relationships with its prey, with its competitors, with the landscape itself. And those relationships shape every aspect of its biology. The Candelarios Formation, the geological unit in which Giganotosaurus was found, preserves a snapshot of the mid-Cretaceous ecosystem of Patagonia, rich and diverse fossil assemblage, containing the remains of dozens of species of dinosaurs, crocodilians, turtles, fish, and other organisms. By studying the fossils in context, their positions in the rock, their associations with other fossils, the nature of the sediments that contain them, paleontologists can begin to reconstruct the living ecosystem. The picture that emerges is one of extraordinary richness and complexity. At the base of the food web were the plants. The mid-Cretaceous flora of Patagonia was dominated by conifers, tall, straight-trunked trees that formed open forests and on the higher ground of the floodplain. These were not the dense, dark coniferous boreal regions. They were more open, more widely spaced trees and an understory of ferns. The candle light and the ground carpeted with vegetation. In the riverbanks, runs and oxbow community was different. Dense stands, their joints several feet above the water, spread across lush green mats. Plants, small, in modern standards, colonized the disturbed mats of the floodplain. Vegetation, community of herbivores. We have already Spinosaurus and the others, the massive herbivores that were the most in the ecosystem, but there were as well. Their ornithopod, medium-sized, bipedal herbivore vegetation. These were social in groups, perhaps through vocalization plays. Their presence in the ecosystem, there was a diverse sources of just the high grass exploited by the sauropods, but a wide variety of lower-growing plants that supported smaller herbivores. And the presence of diverse herbivores tells us something else. The ecosystem could support them all. There was enough plant productivity, enough energy entering the system through photosynthesis, to feed multiple species of enormous herbivores, each one consuming vast quantities of vegetation every day. This in turn tells us about the climate, warm, wet, productive, a greenhouse world where plants grew fast and biomass accumulated quickly. Now let us look at the other predators, because Giganotosaurus was not alone at the top of the food chain. The mid-Cretaceous ecosystem of Patagonia supported multiple species of large and medium-sized carnivores, each occupying a slightly different ecological niche. Among the most interesting of these were the abelisaurids, a family of theropod dinosaurs that were common in the southern continents during the Cretaceous period. Abelisaurids were medium to large predators with distinctive, often ornamented skulls and extremely reduced forelimbs. Some, like the later Carnotaurus, had skulls adorned with horns and bony crests. While no abelisaurid from the Candelaros formation was as large as Giganotosaurus, several were substantial predators in their own right, perhaps 20 to 25 feet long, capable of hunting medium-sized prey and scavenging from the kills of larger predators. There were also smaller theropods, dromaeosaurids, compsognathids, and other small to medium-sized carnivores that occupied the lower tiers of the predator hierarchy. These animals prey, lizards, mammals, small dinosaurs, fish, and played an important role in the ecosystem populations and scavenging from carcasses. And then there were the crocodilians. The rivers and waterways of the mid-Cretaceous floodplain were home to a variety of species. These were ambush predators, lurking in the water and waiting for prey animals to come to the rivers. For smaller dinosaurs and other land, was a dangerous place. The boundary between the terrestrial and aquatic worlds was patrolled by patient, powerful predators with jaws designed to seize and hold. This is the community. This is the web. Giganotosaurus did not live in a vacuum. It lived in a world teeming with others, each one adapted to a specific niche, each one competing for a share of the available prey. The dynamics of this community, who hunted what, who competed with whom, who scavenged from whose kills, were complex. And at the top of it all, at the apex of this intricate, multi-layered predator hierarchy, stood Giganotosaurus. Not because it was the fastest or the smartest or the most agile, but because it was the largest. Because it had evolved the combination of size, weaponry, and strategy that allowed it to tackle the ecosystem, prey that no other predator could touch. There is another dimension to the ecology of Giganotosaurus that we need to consider, and it is one that is notoriously difficult to study in extinct animals: social behavior. Did Giganotosaurus hunt alone, or did it hunt in groups? This question has been debated by paleontologists for decades, and the evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. There are some hints. At a site in Patagonia, the remains of several large Carcharodontosaurus theropods, possibly Giganotosaurus or a closely related species, were found in close association, suggesting that multiple individuals in the same location at roughly indicate that these animals hunting together predators bring down prey large for a single. But the evidence is not conclusive. There are other explanations for why multiple predators might be found in the same place. Perhaps they were drawn to the same water source during a drought and died when the water ran out. Perhaps they were attracted to a large carcass and died from some other cause while feeding on it. Perhaps they were swept together by a flood and deposited in the same location post-mortem. The truth is, we do not know whether Giganotosaurus was a social animal or a solitary one. Both lifestyles have advantages and disadvantages for a large predator. A solitary predator does not have to share its kills. It does not have to compete with members of its own species for food, mates, or territory. It can move freely through the landscape, following prey wherever it goes, without the constraints of group cohesion or social hierarchy. Many modern large predators, tigers, leopards, large crocodilians, are solitary for exactly these reasons, but a social predator can tackle larger prey. A group of Giganotosaurus working together could potentially bring down an adult Argentinosaurus, an animal that would be virtually impossible for a single predator to kill, no matter how large or well-armed. Social hunting also allows for more efficient defensive kills, more effective territorial control, and cooperative rearing of young. The question remains open. Perhaps Giganotosaurus was social during certain phases of its life, forming groups during the breeding season, for example, or cooperating to hunt during periods when prey was scarce and solitary at other times. Perhaps juveniles were more social than adults, forming loose aggregations for mutual protection until they were large enough to hunt alone. Perhaps the answer varied from population to population, depending on local conditions and prey availability. What we can say is that whatever its social structure was, it was effective. Giganotosaurus was the dominant predator of its ecosystem for millions of years. It was successful in the deepest sense of the word. It survived, it reproduced, it persisted across geological time. Whatever strategy it used, it worked. Let us now turn to another aspect of the Giganotosaurus story that deserves attention, the process of paleontological discovery itself. We know about Giganotosaurus is not just a story about one animal, it is a story about science. About the methods, the challenges, the triumphs of extracting knowledge from the deep past. Paleontology is in many ways challenging of all the sciences. The objects of study, fossils, are rare, fragile, and often incomplete. They are embedded in rock, often in remote locations. Extracting them is physically demanding, technically difficult, and expensive. And once they are extracted, the work of interpretation begins, and that work is fraught with uncertainty. Consider the challenges faced by Coria and Salgado when they began to study the Giganotosaurus skeleton. The bones were large and heavy, some of them weighing hundreds of pounds. They were made of stone. The original bone material had been replaced, molecule by molecule, over millions of years, by minerals from the surrounding sediment. Permineralization preserves the shape and internal structure of the bone with remarkable fidelity, but it also makes the fossils extremely heavy. Each bone had to be carefully cleaned, a process that involves removing the surrounding rock matrix grain by grain, using delicate tools like dental picks, air scribes, and fine brushes. This work is painstaking and slow, a single weeks or even months to. And it must be done with extreme care because any crack, any lost fragment means lost in. Once the bone to be measured, photographed, every feature of every bone, every ridge, every groove, every foramen, every attachment scar was recorded and analyzed. This is the raw data of paleontology. From these observations, the researcher size and shape of the animal, the proportions of its body, the relative development of its muscles, and dozens of other anatomical details. But anatomy is only the beginning. To truly understand an extinct animal, you need to place it in context. You need to compare it with other animals, both living and extinct, to determine its evolutionary relationships. You need to analyze the sediments in which it was found to determine its age and the nature of its environment. You need to study the other in the same formation to system in which it lived. This is anatomy and phylogenetic analysis, process of determining its on the evolutionary tree of life. By comparing the bones of Giganotosaurus with those of other theropods, looking for shared features that indicate common ancestry, Coria and Salgado were able to determine that it was a Carcharodontosaurid, a member of a family of large theropods that had been poorly known before its discovery. This placement was significant because it told us something about the biogeography of the Cretaceous world. Odontosaurids were found on multiple continents, in South America, in possibly Europe. This district is consistent with the idea that these continents were connected, or at least close enough for animals to disperse between them during the early and mid-Cretaceous. It provided evidence for the tectonic and geographical models that showed Gondwana breaking apart during this period, with land connections persisting long enough for large-bodied animals to move between the fragments. The discovery of Giganotosaurus, in other words, was not just the discovery of a new species. It was a window into the deep history of the planet, a piece of evidence that helped scientists understand how continents moved, how ecosystems were connected, and how evolution played out on a global scale. Let us spend some more time with the rocks, because the rocks are where everything begins. The rocks are the record. The rocks are the archive. Without them, we would know nothing about Giganotosaurus or any other extinct organism. And the way we read the rocks, the science of stratigraphy, is one of the most elegant and powerful tools in all of geology. The Candelaros Formation, where Giganotosaurus was found, is a sequence of sedimentary rocks that was deposited during the Cenomanian stage of the late Cretaceous period, roughly 100 to 97 million years ago. It is part of a larger sequence of formations, collectively known as the Neuquén Group, that records the geological history of the Neuquén Basin, a large sedimentary basin in northwestern Patagonia. The rocks of the Candelaros Formation are predominantly sandstones and mudstones, rocks that were originally deposited as sand and mud by ancient rivers and streams. The sandstones are often cross-bedded, meaning they contain internal layers that are tilted at an angle to the main bedding, indicating that the sediment was deposited by flowing water. The mudstones are finer-grained, representing sediment that settled out of still or slow-moving water, floodplain deposits, lake deposits, overbank deposits. By studying the sedimentary structures in these rocks, the cross-bedding, the ripple marks, the mud cracks, the channel shapes, geologists can reconstruct the ancient river systems that deposited them. They can determine the direction of flow, the size and shape of the channels, the frequency of flooding, and the overall character of the landscape. This is sedimentological analysis, and it is essential for understanding the environment in which Giganotosaurus lived. The picture that emerges from the Candelaros Formation is one of a braided river system, a network of shallow, wide channels that split and merge across a broad floodplain. This is consistent with a warm, semi-arid to seasonally wet climate, with periodic heavy rainfall causing rivers to flood and spread across the landscape before retreating. The floodplain between the channels was relatively flat and open, covered in low vegetation and dotted with ponds and seasonal wetlands. This is the world of Giganotosaurus, not a jungle, not a swamp, not a desert, but something in between, a dynamic water-dependent landscape that was constantly being reshaped by the rivers that flowed through it. An environment that rewarded adaptability, mobility, and the ability to read the landscape and anticipate its changes. There is something else embedded in the rocks of the Candelaros Formation that we need to discuss. Something that extends beyond the bones and the sediment and into the realm of chemistry. It is called isotope analysis, and it is one of the most powerful tools available to modern paleontologists. Every element on the periodic table exists in multiple forms, called isotopes. Isotopes of the same element have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons, giving them slightly different masses. These differences in mass affect how the isotopes behave in chemical reactions and physical processes, and those differences can be measured with extraordinary precision using a technique called mass spectrometry. In paleontology, isotope analysis is used to answer a wide range of questions about extinct organisms and their environments. The ratio of different oxygen isotopes in fossil bone, for example, can provide information about the temperature and climate of the environment in which the animal lived. The ratio of carbon isotopes can reveal details about the animal's diet, what kinds of plants its prey was eating, and by extension, what kind of ecosystem it inhabited. Studies of isotope ratios in Cretaceous fossils from Patagonia have confirmed what the sedimentological evidence suggests: a warm, wet environment with a diverse plant community and a productive ecosystem capable of supporting large-bodied herbivores and predators. The carbon isotope data indicate a landscape with a mix of plant types, conifers, ferns, and early angiosperms, each drawing carbon from the atmosphere in slightly different ways and leaving distinctive isotopic signatures in the food web. This may sound abstract, but it is profoundly important. It is one of the ways that science transforms speculation into knowledge. We cannot go back in time and take the temperature of the mid-Cretaceous air. But we can measure the oxygen isotope ratios in the bones of animals that breathed that air, and from those measurements we can calculate what the temperature must have been. We cannot watch Giganotosaurus eat, but we can analyze the carbon isotopes in its bones and teeth, and from those analyses we can determine what kinds of animals it was consuming and what those animals were eating. This is the power of modern paleontology. It is no longer just a matter of digging up bones and putting them together. It is a multidisciplinary science that integrates anatomy, geology, chemistry, physics, ecology, and evolutionary biology into a comprehensive picture of life in the deep past. And it is this integrated approach that has allowed us to understand Giganotosaurus not just as a skeleton in a museum, but as a living, breathing animal embedded in a complex and dynamic ecosystem. We have now covered a great deal of ground, literally and figuratively. We have examined the anatomy of Giganotosaurus, the landscape in which it lived, the prey it hunted, the competitors it faced, the scientists who discovered it, and the methods they used to understand it. But there is one more topic we need to address before we move on, and it is perhaps the most important of all. We need to talk about time. Specifically, we need to talk about the position of Giganotosaurus in the grand sweep of evolutionary history, where it came from, what it was related to, and what its existence tells us about the patterns of life on Earth. Giganotosaurus was a Carcharodontosaurid. We have already established that, but what does that mean? Where did the Carcharodontosaurids come from? And how did they become the dominant predators of the southern continents during the mid-Cretaceous? To answer these questions, we need to go back even further in time, to the late Jurassic period, roughly 150 million years ago. This is the age of Allosaurus, another famous theropod predator, smaller but recognizable as a member of the same broad lineage. Allosaurus and its relatives, the Allosaurids, were the dominant large predators of the late Jurassic across the globe in North America, in Africa, in Asia. They were the first truly global dynasty of large theropod predators. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, about 145 million years ago, the Allosaurid lineage began to diversify. Different branches evolved in different directions, adapting to different environments and different prey. One of these branches was the Carcharodontosauridae. The Carcharodontosaurids appear to have originated somewhere in the southern continents, possibly in what is now Africa or South America, and then spread across the connected landmasses of Gondwana. They evolved larger. They developed more specialized teeth, the blade-like serrated teeth that characterize. They became the apex predator of ecosystems. The Carcharodontosaurids were this. Giganotosaurus dominated South America. Carcharodontosaurus dominated North Africa. Mapusaurus, a close relative of Giganotosaurus, was also present in South America. Other Carcharodontosaurids were scattered across the southern continents, but this dynasty was not destined to last. In the latter half of the Cretaceous period, the Carcharodontosaurids began to decline. The reasons are complex and still debated, but they appear to be related to changes in the global environment, shifting continents, changing climates, and evolving ecosystems. As the southern continents continued to fragment and drift apart, the connections that had allowed the Carcharodontosaurids to spread and diversify were severed. As the climate shifted, the ecosystems changed. The enormous sauropods that had been the primary prey of the Carcharodontosaurids became less dominant in some regions, replaced by different kinds of herbivores, ceratops ankylosaurs, that required different predatory strategies. And into the vacuum left by the declining Carcharodontosaurids stepped a new dynasty of Paleosaurids in the south and the Tyrannosaurids in the north. This is the rhythm of evolution. Not a steady march of progress, but a series of dynasties, each one rising, flourishing, and eventually giving way to the next. The Carcharodontosaurids were not replaced because they were inferior, replaced because the world changed and the changes favored different kinds. Evolution does not reward the strongest or the best, it rewards the best, and adaptation is always relative to the specific of the moment. It was perfectly adapted to its world, but its world did not last, and when the animal that had ruled it changed too, not by adapting but by becoming extinct. By making the next set of perfectly adapted animals, the next chapter in the endless, unfolding story of life, there is a tendency, when we talk about extinct animals, to view them through the lens of nostalgia. We marvel at their size, their power, their apparent majesty, and we lament their loss. We treat their extinction as a tragedy, a fall from grace, a failure, a defeat. But this is a fundamentally human way of looking at the world, by our own fears, our own anxieties of mortality. When we mourn the extinction of Giganotosaurus, we are really mourning, projecting our own fragility onto an animal that lived and died without any awareness of concepts like legacy, permanence, or the truth is more interesting and more liberating than the narrative of tragedy. The truth is that extinction is not a failure. It is a intrinsic, necessary, and ultimately creative part of the evolutionary. Without extinction, there would be no evolution. Without the disappearance of old species, there would be no ecological space for new ones. The death of the Carcharodontosaurids made possible the rise of the tyrannosaurids and the abylosaurids. The death of the non-avian dinosaurs made possible the rise of the mammals. The death of the great Permian reptiles made possible the rise of the dinosaurs in the first place. Life is a cycle, a wheel, a spiral. It turns and turns and turns, and every turning brings something new, not better, not worse, but different. Adapted to the conditions of the moment, perfectly suited to the world as it is right now, and destined eventually to give way to something. Giganotosaurus was one turning of the first, and it was not the last, but it was magnificent, and it was real, and it deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote in the story of Tyrannosaurus rex, but as a story in its own right. A story of adaptation, of power, of ecological dominance, and of the inexorable passage of time. Let us continue our exploration of the physical world that Giganotosaurus inhabited by looking more closely at the seasonal rhythms of the mid-Cretaceous landscape, because landscapes are not static, they have pulses, they have cycles, they breathe in and out with the turning of the seasons, and the animals that live in them must synchronize their lives with those rhythms. The mid-Cretaceous climate of Patagonia was warm, as we have discussed, but it was not uniformly warm throughout the year. Even in a greenhouse world without polar ice caps, there were seasonal variations. The tilt of the Earth on its axis still produced seasons, the same basic mechanism that gives us winter and summer today, but the amplitude of those seasons was different. The winters were milder and the summers were warmer, and the overall temperature range was narrower than what we experience in the modern world. What varied more dramatically was rainfall. The sedimentological evidence from the Candelaros Formation suggests a climate with distinct wet and dry seasons. During the wet season, the rivers swelled and flooded the surrounding plains, spreading water and nutrient-rich sediment across the landscape. Vegetation flourished, ponds and wetlands filled. The floodplain became a vast, green, water-rich environment teeming with life. During the dry season, the rivers retreated. The floodplain dried out, the ponds shrank, the vegetation browned and thinned. Animals concentrated around the remaining water sources, the permanent rivers, the deeper ponds, the springs, and competition for resources intensified. These seasonal rhythms would have profoundly affected the behavior of Giganotosaurus. During the wet season, when prey was dispersed across a wide, well-watered landscape, the predator would have had to range widely, covering large distances to find food. During the dry season, when prey was concentrated around water sources, the hunting dynamic would have changed. Prey would have been easier to find but harder to isolate because the herds would be concentrated and the adults would be more alert, more defensive. The dry season may also have been a time of heightened competition among predators. With prey concentrated in smaller areas, multiple Giganotosaurus individuals, or multiple predator species, may have converged on the same resources, leading to increased conflict and competition. This is a pattern we see in modern times of resource scarcity, predator interaction, and the social dynamics of the predator community become more fluid and more volatile. We can imagine the dry season as a time of tension. The Giganotosaurus patrolling the edge of a shrinking waterhole, watching the sauropods that have gathered to drink. Other predators in the vicinity, abylosaurids, smaller theropods, crocodilians in the water. The air is dry and dusty, the vegetation is sparse, resources are limited, and every animal in the ecosystem is under pressure to find enough food, enough water, enough shelter to survive until the rains return. This is not a comfortable vision. It is not the lush, abundant paradise that we sometimes imagine when we think of the dinosaur era. It is a world with limits, a world with constraints, a world where even the mightiest predator had to contend with scarcity, competition, and the unpredictable rhythms of the climate. And it is this world, this real, complex, challenging world, that shaped Giganotosaurus into the animal it was. Not a mindless killing machine, but a finely tuned survival system, adapted to extract maximum benefit from a landscape that was generous during the wet season and stingy during the dry. Let us now consider reproduction. This is one of the most difficult aspects of dinosaur biology to study, because the fossil record preserves behavior only in the most indirect ways. We cannot watch Giganotosaurus mate, lay eggs, or raise its young. But we can make some educated inferences based on what we know about its anatomy, its ecology, and the reproductive biology of its closest living relatives. All dinosaurs laid eggs. This is one of the few generalizations about dinosaur biology that is essentially universal. All known dinosaurs, from the smallest bird-like forms to the largest sauropods, were egg layers. Fossil eggs have been found from a wide variety of dinosaur species, and they range in size from a few centimeters in diameter for small theropods to the size of a football or larger for the biggest sauropods and theropods. No eggs have been definitively attributed to Giganotosaurus. This is not surprising, eggs are fragile, and the connection between a particular egg and a particular species is extremely difficult to establish unless embryonic remains are preserved inside. But we can assume, based on its phylogenetic position and the general patterns of dinosaur reproduction, that Giganotosaurus laid eggs. The eggs were likely laid in nests, perhaps simple depressions scraped in the ground, lined with vegetation, and located in elevated, well-drained areas that would not be flooded during the wet season. The number of eggs in a clutch is unknown, but comparisons with other large theropods suggest it may have been somewhere between a dozen and 20. What happened after the eggs were laid? Did the parents guard the nest? Did they care for the hatchlings? This is where the uncertainty deepens. Some dinosaurs, particularly the small, bird-like theropods that are most closely related to modern birds, appear to have practiced extensive parental care, brooding their eggs and feeding their young. Others, particularly the larger species, may have been more hands-off, laying their eggs and leaving the hatchlings to fend for themselves. For a very large theropod like Giganotosaurus, extensive parental care would have been logistically challenging. An adult Giganotosaurus weighed 6 to 8 tons. A hatchling would have weighed a few pounds at most. The size disparity is enormous, far greater than in any modern bird or crocodilian. An adult Giganotosaurus stepping on its own egg or hatchling could easily crush it. This suggests that parental care, if it existed, was probably limited to nest guarding rather than close physical contact with the eggs or young. The hatchlings would have entered the world small and vulnerable. They would have grown rapidly, passing through a series of size classes as they aged. A juvenile Giganotosaurus, say 1 or 2 years old, would have been a few feet long, small enough to be prey for other predators, including other theropods and large crocodiles. As it grew, it would have moved up the food chain, gradually shifting from lizards, small dinosaurs, fish to larger adult size, and became the apex predator of its ecosystem. This ontogenetic shift, the change in ecological roles, is a pattern we see in many modern predators. A young crocodile feeds on insects and small fish. An adult crocodile feeds on large mammals and other large vertebrates. The same species occupies multiple ecological niches during its lifetime, simply by growing. For Giganotosaurus, this ontogenetic shift would have been dramatic. A hatchling and an adult were, in ecological terms, almost different animals. They occupied different parts of the food web, hunted different prey, faced different threats, and played different roles in the ecosystem. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of dinosaur ecology, the way that a single species could fill multiple ecological niches simultaneously, simply by existing at different size classes. Let us now address the question of metabolism. How did Giganotosaurus power its enormous body? Was it warm-blooded like modern birds and mammals, or was it cold-blooded like modern reptiles? This is one of the most enduring and contentious debates in dinosaur paleontology, and it has direct implications for how we understand the biology and behavior of Giganotosaurus. The traditional view, held for most of the 20th century, was that dinosaurs were cold-blooded, ectothermic in the technical terminology, meaning that they relied on external heat sources, primarily the sun, to regulate their body temperature. Under this view, dinosaurs were essentially large reptiles, sluggish, slow-moving, and dependent on warm climates to remain active. This view has been largely overturned by modern research. The evidence now strongly suggests that most dinosaurs, and particularly the theropods, were endothermic or at least mesothermic, meaning that they generated some or all of their body heat internally, through metabolic processes, much as modern birds and mammals do. The evidence for this comes from multiple lines of inquiry. Bone histology, the study of the internal microscopic structure of bone, reveals that dinosaur bones typically show rapid growth patterns, with dense, highly vascularized tissue that is more similar to the bone of modern mammals and birds than to the bone of modern reptiles. This kind of bone tissue requires a high metabolic rate to produce, a rate that is inconsistent with the low, sun-dependent metabolism of a cold-blooded animal. Additionally, the upright, bipedal posture of theropods like Giganotosaurus is energetically demanding. Maintaining the body in a horizontal position, balanced over the hips with the head held forward and the tail held off the ground, requires continuous muscular effort. A cold-blooded animal would struggle to sustain this posture for extended periods, particularly during cool weather or at night. Finally, there is holotype. Giganotosaurus lived in a world with strong seasonal variation, wet and dry seasons, cooler and warmer periods. A cold-blooded animal of its size would have struggled to remain active during cooler periods, when external were insufficient to warm its enormous body. An endothermic animal, on the other hand, could maintain a stable internal regardless of external conditions, allowing it to remain active and hunting year-round. The most likely scenario is that Giganotosaurus had a metabolic between that of a modern reptile and a modern mammal, thermic or warm-bodied metabolism that combined internal heat generation with the thermal inertia of its enormous body mass. A large animal cools down more slowly than a small one. This is the principle of gigantothermy, and an animal the size of Giganotosaurus would have maintained a relatively stable body temperature simply by virtue of its size, even if its metabolic rate was lower than that of a modern mammal. This is an elegant solution to the energetic challenges of being a giant predator. It allows for sustained activity, walking, tracking, hunting, without the enormous caloric demands of a fully endothermic metabolism. Giganotosaurus operating on a mesothermic metabolism would have needed less food than a comparable-sized mammal, allowing it to survive in an ecosystem where individual hunts were infrequent and the intervals between meals could be long. As we near the end of this first part of our exploration, let us return to the broader picture. Let us step back from the individual animal, from the teeth and the bones and the muscles and the brain, and consider what the existence of Giganotosaurus tells us about the nature of life itself. Giganotosaurus lived for millions of years. Not as an individual, of course. No individual animal lives for millions of years, but as a species, as a lineage, as a thread in the vast tapestry of life on Earth. Years, generation after generation of Giganotosaurus was born, grew, hunted, reproduced plains of ancient Patagonia. Each generation was similar to the one before, the same body plan, the same hunting strategy, the same ecological role, but each generation was also slightly by the subtle, ceaseless pressure of natural, and then, eventually, the thread ended. The last generation of Giganotosaurus lived and died, and no more came after. The species went extinct, and the niche it had occupied was filled by other animals, different animals adapted to a different world. This is the pattern, this is the rhythm, this is the fundamental music of life on Earth. Species rise and species fall. Ecosystems assemble and disassemble. Continents drift, climates shift. And through it all, life persists, not as a fixed, unchanging thing, but as a fluid, dynamic, ever-adapting process that has been running for nearly 4 billion years. Giganotosaurus was one expression of that process, a magnificent expression. An expression that took the theropod body plan, the basic template of a bipedal predatory dinosaur, and pushed it to an extreme of size, power, and ecological dominance that has rarely been matched in the history of life. But it was not the only expression. And it was not the last. The same process that produced Giganotosaurus also produced Tyrannosaurus rex and Allosaurus before it, and the great predatory dinosaurs of the Jurassic and the Triassic before that. And it produced the mammals that replaced the dinosaurs after the great extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. And it produced us, Homo sapiens, the most recent in a long, long line of dominant species that have ruled the Earth for a time and then given way to something new. This is not a depressing thought, it is a liberating one. It tells us that the world is larger than any single species, that the story of life is bigger than any single chapter, that the forces that shape the living world are patient, powerful, and endlessly creative, capable of producing giants and marvels beyond our imagining given enough time. And time is the one thing the Earth has always had in abundance. Before we pause, let us take one more moment to consider the Giganotosaurus in its landscape. Let us try one more time to see it as it was, not as a skeleton in a museum, not as a name in a textbook, not as a point of comparison with T-Rex, but as a living animal moving through a living world. It is late afternoon on the Cretaceous floodplain. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the ground. A flock of pterosaurs, flying reptiles with wingspans of 10 or 15 feet, wheels overhead, their shadows flickering across the surface of a slow-moving river. Along the riverbank, a group of small ornithopod dinosaurs feeds on ferns, their heads bobbing up and down as they strip leaves from the fronds. In the water, a crocodilian drifts silently, only its eyes and nostrils above the surface, watching the ornithopods with the timeless patience of an ambushed predator. And beyond the river on the open floodplain, a Giganotosaurus stands. It is still. Its head is raised, its nostrils flared. It is facing into the wind, sampling the air, processing the complex mosaic of scents that the breeze carries across the landscape. The fading sunlight catches the texture of its skin, rough, pebbly, perhaps patterned with dark and light markings that help it blend into the dappled shade of the forest edge. It has not eaten in several days. Its last meal was a sub-adult sauropod that it tracked and wore down over the course of an afternoon. The carcass lasted 2 days before other predators, smaller theropods, scavenging pterosaurs, and insects stripped it to bone. Now the Giganotosaurus is hungry again, and it is scanning the landscape for the next opportunity. In the distance, beyond a stand of Araucarian trees, a herd of sauropods is visible, massive shapes moving slowly across the floodplain, their long necks swaying as they feed. The Giganotosaurus watches them. It does not move yet. It is assessing, calculating, waiting. The light fades, the temperature drops slightly. The sounds of the landscape shift, the calls of daytime animals giving way to the rustling, chirping, and buzzing of the nocturnal world. The Giganotosaurus remains where it is, a darker shadow among the darkening shadows of the forest edge. Waiting, patient, enduring. This is its world. This is its time. And for millions of years, in span of time so vast that the human mind can barely comprehend it, this scene played out again and again in countless variations across the broad, shifting, water-sculpted landscape of Cretaceous Patagonia. The giant southern lizard, the forgotten titan, the predator that came before, its story is far from over. We have only just begun. We will continue this journey in the next part of our documentary. We will delve deeper into the evolutionary relationships of Giganotosaurus and the Carcharodontosaurids. We will explore the end of their dynasty and the rise of the Tyrannosaurids. We will examine the great extinction that ended the age of dinosaurs and consider what it means for us, the latest in a long line of dominant species on this ancient, ever-changing planet. We will confront the myths, the misunderstandings, and the deeply human tendencies that color our view of prehistoric life. And we will ask ultimately what Giganotosaurus can teach us about the nature of power, the nature of time, and the nature of existence itself. That journey continues now in part 2. We left our giant standing at the edge of a forest, watching a herd of sauropods in the fading light of a Cretaceous afternoon. Patient, still, enduring, a predator built by millions of years of evolutionary pressure into a machine of such precision and power that nothing in its world could challenge it directly. But the world was changing. It was always changing. No amount of powerful perfection, no depth of evolutionary refinement can hold back the forces that reshape a planet over geological. The story of Giganotosaurus, story about that truth, about the tension between individual and the indifference of the universe, about the way that life, no matter how magnificent, is temporary, always subject to forces larger than itself, always in the end part of a cycle that has no beginning and no end. In this second part of our journey, we are going to follow that story to its conclusion. We are going to watch the dynasty of the giant Carcharodontosaurid predators rise to its peak and then begin its long, slow decline. We are going to explore the forces, geological, climatic, ecological, evolutionary, that brought the reign of Giganotosaurus to an end. We are going to meet the successors, the animals that filled the ecological space left behind. We are going to examine the great extinction that eventually claimed all the non-avian dinosaurs and reshaped the living world from the ground up. And then we are going to step back even further and ask the biggest questions of all. What does the story of Giganotosaurus mean about the nature of life, the nature of evolution, and the nature of the world we inhabit? What can a predator that has been dead for 90 million years and about ourselves? These are not easy questions, but they are important ones, and the story of Giganotosaurus, this magnificent, overlooked, underappreciated giant of the ancient world, is the perfect lens in them. Let us continue one more time to the bones, because the bones are always where they are the primary evidence. The foundation on which everything else is built, and the bones of Giganotosaurus tell us than we have yet heard. When Rodolfo Coria and Leonardo Salgado first described the animal in 1995, they had a single specimen, 90% complete, as we discussed, found near the town of El Chacon in the Neuquén province of Argentina. This specimen became the holotype, the official reference specimen for the species, the individual against which all other potential members of the species would be compared. But paleontology does not rest with a single. Science is iterative, accumulative, self-correcting. And in the year description of Giganotosaurus, more material was found. More expeditions were mounted in the Neuquén province. More fossils were excavated, prepared, and studied. And with each new discovery, the picture became richer and more detailed. One of the most significant subsequent discoveries was a fragment of a jawbone that appeared to belong to an individual even larger than the holotype. This fragment suggested that the specimen described in 1995 was not the largest individual of its kind, that there may have been even bigger Giganotosaurus walking the floodplains of Cretaceous Patagonia. Estimates based on the jaw fragment suggest an animal perhaps 8% larger than the holotype, which would push the total body length above 43 feet and the weight potentially above 8 tons. We must be careful with such estimates. A single bone fragment can only tell us so much. The margin of error in size estimates for incomplete specimens is substantial. But the fragment is significant because it suggests that the specimen we know was not exceptional, not a freak individual that happened large. Instead, it suggests that Giganotosaurus regularly reached very large sizes, and that the individual found near El Chacon was simply one specimen in a population of similarly giant animals. This has implications for our understanding of the ecology of the species. Large size was normal for Giganotosaurus. If the population was consistently producing individuals in the 40-foot range, then we need to explain how the ecosystem could support so many large-bodied predators. Large predators require large amounts of food. A Giganotosaurus of 8 tons, eating perhaps 2 to 3% of its body weight per day when actively growing and perhaps less when fully grown, would have required several hundred pounds of meat per week during peak consumption. Across a population of multiple individuals, this represents an enormous demand on the prey base. The only way this demand could be met was if the prey base was itself enormous. And this brings us back to Argentinosaurus and the other giant sauropods, animals of such colossal size that a single individual could theoretically feed a Giganotosaurus for weeks. An adult Argentinosaurus, if it weighed 80 or 90 tons, contained enough calories to sustain a large theropod predator for a very long time indeed. Even allowing for losses to scavengers and decay, a single large sauropod carcass was a substantial resource. This, in turn, tells us something about the hunting frequency of Giganotosaurus. Unlike a modern lion, which must hunt every few days to survive, a large theropod predator hunting large sauropod prey may have fed much less frequently, perhaps once every week or two, or even less often during periods of plenty. Between meals, the animal would have rested, conserved energy, and maintained its territory. This pattern of infrequent, high-value meals is more similar to the feeding ecology of large modern, particularly large crocodilians and Komodo dragons, than to the feeding ecology of large mammals. A Nile crocodile can go for months without eating after a large meal. A Komodo dragon, after consuming a large prey animal, may fast for several weeks. If Giganotosaurus had a similar metabolic profile, lower than a mammal but higher than a typical reptile, it may have been capable of extended fasting periods between large kills. This is speculative, of course, but it is consistent with what we know about the physics of large body size, the energetics of mesothermic metabolism, and the ecology of infrequent, high-value prey. Let us now explore the Carcharodontosaurid family more broadly. Because Giganotosaurus did not exist in evolutionary isolation, it was part of a dynasty, a lineage of predators that had deep evolutionary roots and broad geographical distribution. Understanding the family helps us understand the individual. The Carcharodontosauridae, as a family, are now known from multiple continents and multiple geological time periods. Their roots appear to lie in the early Cretaceous, perhaps 130 to 1 million years ago, in the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. The earliest known members of the family were already large theropods by the standards of their time, though not yet as large as the mid-Cretaceous giants. As the Cretaceous progressed, the Carcharodontosaurids diversified and spread. In North Africa, Carcharodontosaurus saharicus became the dominant large predator, an animal comparable in size to Giganotosaurus, known from fragmentary remains including a partial skull and isolated bones. In South America, Giganotosaurus and its close relative Mapusaurus occupied the apex predator niche. Possible Carcharodontosaurid material has been reported from Asia and Europe as well, suggesting that the family had a truly global reach during its peak. This geographical spread is not coincidental. It reflects the tectonic history of the mid-Cretaceous world. During the early Cretaceous, the continents of the southern hemisphere were still partially connected, or at least close enough to each other that animals could disperse between them across shallow seaways or temporary land bridges. This connectivity allowed the Carcharodontosaurids to spread from their point of origin across multiple continents, establishing populations in different parts of the world. As the Cretaceous progressed and the southern continents drifted further apart, these populations became isolated, cut off from each other by widening oceans. They evolved, adapting to local conditions, local prey, local competitors. The result was a family of broadly similar but distinctly different apex predators, each one the product of its own evolutionary history and its own ecological context. Mapusaurus roseae, the closest known relative of Giganotosaurus, is particularly interesting in this context. Known from a bone bed, a concentrated deposit of bones from multiple individuals, in the Huincull Formation of Argentina, Mapusaurus was a large Carcharodontosaurid that coexisted with Giganotosaurus in space, though perhaps not entirely in time. The two species were closely related, perhaps as similar to each other as a lion and a leopard, and they may have occupied slightly different ecological niches, different prey preferences, different habitat associations that allowed them to coexist without excessive competition. The Mapusaurus bone bed is significant for another reason. The presence of multiple individuals in a single deposit has been interpreted by some paleontologists as evidence of pack hunting or group behavior in these large Carcharodontosaurids. If multiple Mapusaurus, or by extension Giganotosaurus, were living or hunting together, then the scale of the predatory pressure on the sauropod herds was even greater than we have imagined. A group of large Carcharodontosaurids working cooperatively could potentially have brought down prey that would be invulnerable to a single individual. But as we discussed earlier, the evidence for pack hunting in these animals is not conclusive. Bone beds can form for many reasons, and the presence of multiple predators in the same location does not necessarily imply cooperative behavior. The debate continues, and it is a reminder of how much we still do not know about the behavior of these extraordinary animals. Now let us turn to the question of decline, its end. The Carcharodontosaurids were dominant in the southern continents from roughly the early Cretaceous until approximately 90 million years ago, a reign of tens of millions of years. But by the late Cretaceous, they were gone. What happened? The answer is complex, and it involves multiple overlapping factors. Let us take them one at a time. The first factor is continental drift. As the southern continents drifted apart, the ecosystems they carried with them began to diverge. South America, becoming more isolated from Africa, began to develop its own distinctive fauna, animals found nowhere else on Earth. The dinosaur communities of South America in the late Cretaceous looked different from those of North America, different from those of Asia, different from those of Europe. They are a product of their own evolutionary trajectory, shaped by the specific conditions of an isolated continent. As South America became more isolated, the large sauropod prey that the Carcharodontosaurids had depended on began to change. The diversity and abundance of giant titanosaurs shifted over time. New kinds of titanosaurs evolved, some of the older lineages disappeared, and as the prey community changed, the predator community had to change with it or face extinction. The second factor is climate. The late Cretaceous was a time of significant climatic change globally. While the world remained warmer than today, there were periods of cooling and aridification that affected regional ecosystems. In some parts of the world, the lush, productive floodplain habitats that had supported the great sauropod communities began to shift. Forests changed, river systems changed. The specific ecological conditions that had produced the extraordinary biodiversity of the Candelaros Formation did not persist unchanged through the late Cretaceous. The third factor is competition. In the late Cretaceous of South America, a new group of large predators was rising to prominence, the aegyptiacids. These were medium to large theropods, not as large as Giganotosaurus, but faster, more agile, and perhaps better adapted to the changing ecological conditions of the late Cretaceous landscape. Animals like Carnotaurus, with its distinctive horns and deeply modified skull, represent the peak of aegyptiacid evolution, which occurred in the late Cretaceous after the decline of the Carcharodontosaurids. The aegyptiacids and the Carcharodontosaurids were competitors, occupying overlapping ecological niches. As the Carcharodontosaurids declined, the aegyptiacids expanded to fill the space they left behind. Whether the decline of the Carcharodontosaurids caused the rise of the aegyptiacids, or whether the rise of the aegyptiacids caused the decline of the Carcharodontosaurids, or whether both were driven by the same underlying environmental changes, is difficult to determine from the fossil record. The interactions between these groups were complex, and the transition period is incomplete. What we can say is that by approximately 90 million years ago, the Carcharodontosaurids appear to have been in significant decline, and by the final phase of the Cretaceous, the Maastrichtian age, roughly 70 to 66 million years ago, they appear to have been entirely gone from South America, replaced by a very different fauna of predators and prey. The giant southern lizard had run its course. The world had moved on, But let us not leave the Carcharodontosaurus story without following it to its most remote branches, because the lineage that produced Giganotosaurus was not the only branch of the family tree. And one of the most remarkable discoveries in recent paleontology has been the realization that Carcharodontosaurids, or their close relatives, may have persisted in some parts of the world for much longer than previously thought. In the late Cretaceous of Asia, a group of large theropods called the Megaraptorans have been a subject of considerable debate. For many years, these animals, known from materials found in Argentina, Australia, and Asia, were classified variously as coelurosaurs, tyrannosauroids, or members of other theropod groups. But more recent analyses have suggested that at least some of the Megaraptorans may be closely related to the Carcharodontosaurids, perhaps representing a late surviving branch of the family into the final stages of the Cretaceous. If this interpretation is correct, it means that the lineage that includes Giganotosaurus did not settle of the Cretaceous. Instead, it persisted in diminished and modified form all the way to the final days of the dinosaur era. The last Carcharodontosaurid relatives may have lived and died alongside Tyrannosaurus rex, separated by continents but coexisting in time. This is a remarkable thought. The descendants, or at least the distant relatives, of Giganotosaurus may have survived to witness the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs. The dynasty of the giant southern lizards may have had a longer run than we realized. But whether this interpretation is ultimately confirmed or refuted, it does not change the fundamental story. The golden age of the Carcharodontosaurids, the period of their greatest size, their widest distribution, and their most complete ecological dominance, was the mid-Cretaceous, and Giganotosaurus was the pinnacle of that golden age. Now we must turn to the animal that replaced Giganotosaurus, and to some extent in the ecological role of apex theropod predator, though in a different time and place. We must talk about Tyrannosaurus rex. The comparison is inevitable. It has been made since the discovery of Giganotosaurus in 1993. Who would win in a fight, Giganotosaurus or T-Rex? Which one was bigger? Which one was more powerful? Which one was the best? These are not entirely scientific questions. They are in large part questions of human psychology, reflections of our tendencies, biological and ecological realities to simple contests of dominance. To rank, to compare, to pick winners and losers, it is the same that drives us to argue about which sports team is the best or which historical figure was the greatest. It is deeply human, and it is not entirely without value, because comparisons force us to examine the specific subject in detail. But comparisons can also mislead. This is what makes each subject unique and important in its own right. And in the case of Giganotosaurus and T-Rex, the comparison obscures something crucial. These two animals were not rivals. They were not competitors. They were not even contemporaries. 30 million them, a gulf of time so immense that it makes the comparison almost meaningless in ecological terms. Nevertheless, let us make the comparison, not to determine a winner, but to illuminate the differences, to show how two lineages of theropod predators arrived at similar sizes through completely different paths, with completely different anatomical solutions, adapted to completely different ecologies. We have already discussed Giganotosaurus in some long, narrow skull, the blade-like teeth, the slashing hunting strategy, the relatively low bite force. Now let us briefly consider T-Rex. Rex evolved in North America roughly 68 to 66 million years ago. It was the last and largest of the tyrannosaurids, a family of large theropods that had evolved in Asia during the mid-Cretaceous and spread to North America as land connections between the two continents were re-established. The tyrannosaurids were in some ways a mirror image of the Carcharodontosaurids, a dynasty of large predators that rose to dominance in the northern continents roughly as the Carcharodontosaurids were declining in the south. The anatomy of T-Rex reflected its ecological context. The prey animals of late Cretaceous North America were different from those of mid-Cretaceous South America. Instead of enormous long-necked sauropods, the late Cretaceous of North America was home to ceratopsians, horned dinosaurs like Triceratops, and hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs like Edmontosaurus. These animals were faster than sauropods, more agile, and equipped with their own defensive weapons, the horns and frills of the ceratopsians, the speed and herding behavior of the hadrosaurs. To hunt these prey animals effectively, T-Rex needed a different set of tools than Giganotosaurus. It needed strength more than speed. It needed the ability to overpower and subdue prey that could fight back more effectively than a slow-moving sauropod. And it needed teeth and jaws that could penetrate bone, because the ceratopsians and hadrosaurs of late Cretaceous North America were animals that could be dispatched most efficiently by a bone-crushing bite to a critical area. Hence the famous T-Rex skull, deep, wide, massively built, with the most powerful bite force of any land predator in the fossil record. The banana-shaped teeth designed not to slice but to grip and crush. The enormous jaw muscles capable of generating forces that modern engineering calculations suggest may have exceeded 12,000 pounds and through solid bone with ease. Two different predators, two different skulls, two different sets of teeth, two different hunting strategies, and two different prey communities, separated by 30 million years and an ocean of evolutionary time. The real lesson of the Giganotosaurus T-Rex comparison is not about which animal was more powerful, richness and creativity of evolution, about the way that the same, a large bipedal predatory dinosaur, can be modified, refined in multiple different directions, each one to a specific set of ecological challenges. A lesson in the almost limitless adaptability of life, and it is a lesson that makes both animals more interesting, not less, when understood in their proper context. There is another dimension to the story of Giganotosaurus and T-Rex that deserves attention. It is a dimension that goes beyond anatomy and ecology and into the realm of cultural history. Because the way we perceive these animals, the stories we tell about them, the images we project onto them, the emotions they evoke in us, says as much about human psychology as it does about the animals themselves. Tyrannosaurus rex has been the dominant dinosaur in the popular imagination for over a century. Since its formal description in 1905, it has appeared in more films, more television programs, more books, and more museum displays than any other prehistoric animal. It has become a cultural icon, a symbol of power, of ferocity, of the savage, primordial world that preceded human civilization. But this image is a construction. It is a story we have told ourselves, layered over the actual animal, obscuring the biological reality beneath. The T-Rex of popular culture, roaring, rampaging, endlessly aggressive, is not the T-Rex of the fossil record. The real animal was a precision predator, adapted to its specific ecological context, no more or less savage than any other predator in the history of life. It did what it needed to do to survive, nothing more, nothing less. The same is true of Giganotosaurus. When it was discovered and publicized as bigger than T-Rex, the popular response was to imagine it as an even more savage, even more terrifying beast, a super predator that made T-Rex look tame by comparison. This is exactly the wrong way to think about it. Giganotosaurus was not defined by its size. It was defined by its adaptations, the specific combination of anatomical features that allowed it to survive and reproduce in a specific ecological context. Its size was a consequence of those adaptations, not the cause. It was large because its prey was large, and because large size conferred advantages in its specific hunting strategy. It was not large for the sake of being large. It was not terrifying for the sake of being terrifying. The narrator of any serious discussion of these animals must resist the temptation to frame them in terms of human emotion, terror, savagery, ferocity, brutality. These words do not. They describe our reactions to the injections of human moral categories onto beings that operated entirely outside the realm of human morality. A Giganotosaurus attacking an Argentinosaurus was not performing an act of violence. It was not expressing aggression or cruelty or any other human emotion. It was doing what its body, its brain, and its evolutionary history had prepared it to do. It was converting plant material eaten by the sauropod into meat, and then converting that meat into energy which it used to move, to hunt, to reproduce, to survive. This is what predators do. This is what they have always done. And there is nothing savage about it. There is only life in all its magnificent, pitiless, beautiful complexity. Let us now return to the landscape one more time, but from a different angle. Let us look at the fossil record not as a collection of isolated specimens, but as a window into an entire ecosystem, a system that functioned, balanced, and maintained itself for millions of years before the Carcharodontosaurids declined. One of the most powerful tools available to modern paleontologists is the analysis of fossil assemblages, not just the individual fossils, but the entire community of organisms found in a particular geological unit. By cataloging every species present in the Candelarios Formation, their relative abundances, their sizes, their ecological roles, and their relationships with each other, scientists can begin to reconstruct a picture of the living ecosystem that is far richer than any single fossil can provide. The Candelarios Formation is not the only mid-Cretaceous fossil-bearing unit in the New Queen province. Adjacent formations, the Lohan-Kura-Huinkul Formation, preserve different time slices of the same general region, allowing scientists to track how the ecosystem. Together, these formations provide a detailed record of the mid-Cretaceous ecosystem of Patagonia, its composition, its dynamics, and its changes over millions of years. What this record reveals is a system of remarkable stability, punctuated by episodes of change. For millions of years, the basic structure of the ecosystem persisted. Giant sauropods as the dominant herbivores, Carcharodontosaurids as the apex predators, abelisaurids and other theropods as secondary predators, crocodilians in the aquatic environments, pterosaurs in the air. This structure was maintained by the same fundamental ecological processes that maintain ecosystems today: predation, competition, mutualism, nutrient cycling, energy flow. But it was not static. Over millions of years went. Individual species within each ecological role were replaced by other species occupying the same role. The sauropod fauna changed, some species disappeared and were replaced by others. The composition of the predator community shifted, the plant communities evolved, but the overall structure, the basic architecture of the food web, remained remarkably consistent. This is ecosystem resilience. It is the ability of a complex ecological system to absorb perturbations, changes in species composition, fluctuations in climate, shifts in resource availability without fundamentally changing its structure. Systems are not rigid, they are flexible. They can accommodate change at the species level while maintaining stability at the community level. The mid-Cretaceous ecosystem of Patagonia appears to have been highly resilient in this sense. It endured for tens of millions of years through changes in climate, changes in continental configuration, and changes in the global biosphere. It was built on a foundation of enormous herbivore productivity, the extraordinary amount of plant material consumed and converted into biomass by the giant sauropods, and the equally extraordinary predatory efficiency of the Carcharodontosaurid apex predators. And then, eventually, it changed. Not abruptly, not in the way of a mass extinction event, but gradually over millions of years as the conditions that had produced and maintained it slowly shifted. The sauropod fauna changed, the predator community changed, the climate changed, and the specific combination of conditions that had supported Giganotosaurus as the dominant apex predator of the region gave way to a new configuration, one in which different animals played the dominant roles. This is not a story of failure or collapse. It is a story of succession, of ecological transition, of the same fundamental processes of adaptation and change that have been operating on Earth for 4 billion years. Now let us address something that has been hovering at the edges of our discussion throughout this documentary. It is the question of what we mean when we use words like ruler or dominant or apex predator. Because these words carry implications about power, about hierarchy, about permanence, that are not always fully examined. When we say that Giganotosaurus was the apex predator of its ecosystem, we mean something specific and limited. We mean that it was the largest carnivore in the food web, that it was capable of killing the largest prey animals, and that no other predator regularly preyed on adult Giganotosaurus. This is the technical definition of an apex predator. And by this definition, Giganotosaurus clearly qualifies. But the word apex carries a sense of elevation, a sense of being above, of looking down on a lesser world, and this sense is misleading. Giganotosaurus was not above its ecosystem. It was embedded in it. It was dependent on it. It could not exist without the sauropods it hunted, without the plants that fed the sauropods, without the rivers that watered the sun that powered the whole system. Remove any one of those ex-predator collapses along with everything else. This is one of the most important lessons of ecology. There is no such thing as a truly independent organism. Every living thing is connected to every other living thing through webs of dependence, direct and indirect, obvious and subtle. The Giganotosaurus depended on the Argentinosaurus. The Argentinosaurus depended on the conifers. The conifers depended on the rain. The rain depended on the atmospheric circulation patterns driven by the temperature gradient between the equator and the poles. And on through chains of connection that extend across the entire planetary system. When we call Giganotosaurus a ruler of its world, we are using a metaphor, a human metaphor, drawn from our experience of political systems and social hierarchies. And like all metaphors, it captures something true while obscuring something else. It captures the reality of ecological dominance, the fact that Giganotosaurus was the most powerful predator in its ecosystem, capable of preying on animals that no other predator could touch. But it obscures the reality of ecological dependence, the fact that this power was entirely contingent on the health and productivity of the system that supported it. A ruler can exist without subjects. An apex predator cannot exist without prey. The distinction matters. Let us also consider the question of individual versus species. When we discuss Giganotosaurus, we tend to talk about it as if it were a single entity, the Giganotosaurus, as though the species were one continuous, unified being. But of course, this is not the case. Giganotosaurus was millions of individuals, born and dying across millions of years. Each individual lived a life of its own, with its own challenges, its own successes and failures, its own moments of hunger and satiation, its own injuries and recoveries. Some individuals were successful hunters, others were not. Some grew large and lived to old age. Others were killed young by injury, by disease, by starvation, or by other predators. Some mated successfully and left offspring. Others did not. The variation among individuals was enormous, and it was this variation that provided the raw material for evolution. The subtle differences in anatomy, physiology, and behavior that natural selection could work on, favoring some variants and disfavoring others over millions of generations. When we look at a fossil of Giganotosaurus, we are looking at one individual, one data point in a distribution that spanned millions of years and countless generations. This individual was in most ways typical of its species, but it was also unique. It had a particular history. It had lived through particular experiences that had left their mark on its bones, healed injuries perhaps, or signs of nutritional stress recorded in the growth patterns of its bone tissue. Bone histology, the study of the microscopic structure of bone tissue, can reveal these individual histories. By cutting thin sections of fossil bone and examining them under a microscope, paleontologists can count the growth rings, lines of arrested growth, similar to tree rings that are deposited annually in many vertebrate bones. By counting these rings, they can estimate the age of the individual at death. By analyzing the spacing between the rings, they can determine how fast the animal was growing at different stages of its life. Such analyses have been performed on a number of large theropod bones from the late Cretaceous and related periods, and they reveal growth patterns that are surprisingly similar to those of modern large birds and some mammals. Young large theropods grew rapidly, sometimes several hundred kilograms per year, and reached adult size within perhaps 10 to 20 years. Growth then slowed dramatically, and further changes in body size were gradual or absent. This rapid early growth rate is consistent with a relatively high metabolic rate, consistent with the mesothermic or near endothermic metabolism we discussed earlier. A cold-blooded animal simply could not sustain the growth rates that the bone histology reveals. This is one of the strongest lines of evidence for elevated metabolism in large theropods, and it supports the view that animals like Giganotosaurus were physiologically more similar to modern birds or large mammals than to modern reptiles. We have spent considerable time discussing the biology and ecology of Giganotosaurus in detail. But there is a broader story that we have been building toward, one that places this individual animal, this individual species, in the context of the entire history of life on Earth. It is time to tell that broader story. Let us go back to the beginning, not to the Cretaceous, not to the Jurassic, but to the very beginning, to the emergence of complex life and the first appearance of the body plans that would eventually give rise to animals like Giganotosaurus. The ancestors of all dinosaurs were small, lizard-like reptiles of the Triassic period, a time of geological upheaval and biological recovery following the devastating mass extinction at the end of the Permian period, approximately 252 million years ago. The Permian extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying, was the largest mass extinction in the history of animal life. It killed approximately 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. It was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale, and the recovery from it took millions of years, but recovery came. Life, as it always does, found a way. From the survivors of the Permian extinction, new lineages evolved, lineages that would come to dominate the world in ways that could not have been predicted from the ashes of the catastrophe. Among these lineages were the archosaurs, a group that included the ancestors of both the crocodilians and the dinosaurs. In the early Triassic, the archosaurs were just one group among many, competing with other reptile lineages for ecological space in a world slowly recovering from near-total extinction. But over the course of the Triassic, the archosaurs diversified and expanded. They evolved new body plans, new feeding strategies, new ways of moving and interacting with their environments. And eventually, they came to dominate the terrestrial vertebrate community in a way that no single lineage had done before. The dinosaurs first appear in the fossil record during the late Triassic period, approximately 230 million years ago. They were not initially the dominant animals of their world. Early dinosaurs were modest-sized creatures, some bipedal, some quadrupedal, some carnivorous, some herbivorous, that shared the landscape with many other reptile groups. The ecological dominance of the dinosaurs came gradually, through the late Triassic and into the early Jurassic, as other competing lineages declined and the dinosaurs expanded to fill the available ecological space. The reasons for the rise of the dinosaurs to ecological dominance are debated. Some researchers argue that dinosaurs were simply better adapted than their competitors, that their combination of upright posture, high metabolic rates, and reproductive strategies gave them a consistent advantage in competition with other reptile groups. Others argue that the rise of the dinosaurs was largely a matter of opportunity, that a series of extinction events during the Triassic and early Jurassic eliminated many of their competitors, and the dinosaurs simply filled the vacated niches. The truth is probably a combination of both factors. The dinosaurs had real biological advantages, particularly the upright, fully erect posture that allowed them to move efficiently and breathe effectively during locomotion. But they also benefited from the elimination of competitors by extinction events that they were better able to survive. Both factors worked together to produce the dinosaur dominance of the Mesozoic, and once established, that dominance was extraordinary. For approximately 165 million years, from the late Triassic to the end of the Cretaceous, non-avian dinosaurs were the dominant large terrestrial vertebrates on Earth. They occupied every available ecological niche, from tiny insectivores to enormous herbivores, from small, fast predators to the colossal giants we have been discussing. They lived on every continent. They adapted to every climate. And they produced, over those 165 million years, a diversity of forms and lifestyles that staggers the imagination. Giganotosaurus was one product of this extraordinary diversification. It came near the midpoint of the dinosaurian era, at a moment when the theropod lineage had been diversifying for nearly 100 million years, exploring and re-exploring the design space of the large, predatory bipedal dinosaur. The Carcharodontosaurids were one of the most successful of these explorations, perfectly adapted to their specific ecological context, dominant in their world, and representative of the extraordinary creativity of the evolutionary process. We cannot discuss the history of the dinosaurs without eventually confronting the ending, the Great Extinction. The catastrophic event that brought the age of the non-avian dinosaurs to a close 66 million years ago, paving the way for a new world, a world of mammals, of birds, of the eventual emergence of the primates, and ultimately of ourselves. The extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous, known as the KPG extinction or the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, was one of the 5 great mass extinctions in the history of complex animal life. In terms of its effects on terrestrial ecosystems, it was the most dramatic, eliminating not just the non-avian dinosaurs, but also the pterosaurs, the large marine reptiles, the ammonites, and many other groups of organisms. The primary cause is now well established. 66 million years ago, an asteroid or comet approximately 10 kilometers in diameter struck the Earth at a site near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The impact released an amount of energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, vaporizing rock and ejecting enormous quantities of debris into the atmosphere. The immediate effects were devastating: a fireball, a tsunami, earthquakes, and wildfires on a global scale. But the immediate effects, as catastrophic as they were, may not have been the primary driver of the extinction. The longer-term effects were even more significant. The debris ejected into the atmosphere, soot from the wildfires, dust from the pulverized rock, formed a dense shroud around the planet that blocked sunlight for months, perhaps years. In the absence of sunlight, photosynthesis stopped, plants died. The food chains that depended on plants collapsed, starting at the bottom and working upward. Herbivores starved, and then the predators that depended on the herbivores starved. The extinction was not instantaneous. It played out over years, perhaps decades. Different species responded differently. Those that could survive on dead organic matter, decomposers, scavengers, seed-eaters, had an advantage in the initial phase of the extinction. Those that required living plants or fresh prey were hit immediately. And those that required large amounts of living prey, large predators in other words, were among the most vulnerable. By 66 million years ago, of course, Giganotosaurus was already gone. The great Carcharodontosaurid dynasty had ended some 30 million years earlier, but the broader community of large non-avian dinosaurs, the tyrannosaurids, the ceratopsians, the hadrosaurs, the ankylosaurs, the remaining sauropods, all of these were present at the time of the impact, and all of them perished. The only dinosaurs that survived were the birds, members of the avian lineage of theropods that had been diversifying since the late Jurassic. Birds survived the extinction because of a combination of factors: small body size, which meant they needed less food, the ability to fly, which gave them access to a wider range of resources, and perhaps their highly active metabolism, which allowed them to be flexible in their food sources and behavioral strategies. The survival of the birds is one of the most profound facts in the history of life. It means that the dinosaurs are not entirely gone. They are still here in the form of the 10,000 or so species of birds that inhabit every corner of the planet today. Every time you see a crow, a pigeon, a hawk, a sparrow, or an eagle, you are looking at a dinosaur, a direct descendant of the same theropod lineage that produced Giganotosaurus. The birds are, in a very real sense, the living legacy of the great theropod dynasty. They carry within their bodies, in their skeletal structure, their metabolic systems, their reproductive biology, their brain architecture, the evolutionary heritage of a lineage that stretches back 230 million years. When a hawk stoops on a sparrow, it is performing the same fundamental act that Giganotosaurus performed on Argentinosaurus, converting prey into energy, maintaining the flow of matter and energy through the food web, playing its role in the great cycle of life. The scale is different, the players are different, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. And recognizing this continuity, this unbroken thread that runs from the first dinosaurs through Giganotosaurus and all the other giants of the Mesozoic, through the KPG extinction, and down to the birds singing outside your window right now, is one of the most profound and beautiful insights that paleontology can offer. Let us now turn to the question of myth. Because the history of paleontology is not just a history of discovery and scientific progress, it is also a history of storytelling, of the narratives we construct around the raw data of fossils, of the meanings we find or impose on the evidence from the deep past. Every era of paleontology has its myths. The earliest paleontologists, working in the 18th and early 19th centuries, sometimes interpreted large fossil bones as the remains of giants, mythological beings from ancient tradition. As the science developed and the true nature of fossils became clear, those myths were replaced by other myths: the myth of the bestial, cold-blooded dinosaur, the myth of the relentless killing machine, the myth of the evolutionary failure. These myths are not neutral, they carry cultural baggage. They reflect the values, assumptions, and anxieties of the societies that produced them. The image of the dinosaur as a cold-blooded, primitive brute, doomed by its own inadequacy to be replaced by the warm-blooded, intelligent mammals, was, in part, Victorian-era ideas about progress, hierarchy, and the inevitable triumph of the more advanced form. It was a story that flattered the mammal perspective, our perspective, by casting the dinosaurs as a failed experiment that simply had to give way to something better. But this story is wrong, not just in its biological details, the cold-bloodedness, the mental inadequacy, but in its fundamental framing. The dinosaurs were not a failed experiment. They were one of the most successful lineages of animals in the history of life. They dominated the Earth for over 165 million years, a period that dwarfs the entire evolutionary history of the primates. They were diverse, adaptable, and ecologically sophisticated. They produced forms of breathtaking variety and beauty, and they did not simply die out, they gave rise to the birds which continue to thrive today. The myth of the dinosaur as a primitive brute has been largely dispelled by modern science, but other myths persist. The myth of the killing machine, the idea that predatory dinosaurs like Giganotosaurus were essentially mindless engines of destruction, driven by bloodlust and incapable of anything but violence, is one that dies hard. This myth misunderstands what predation is. Predation is not violence in any morally meaningful sense. It is an ecological relationship, a transfer of energy from one organism to another, governed by the same principles of efficiency and optimization that govern all biological processes. A Giganotosaurus killing an Argentinosaurus was doing something no different, in ecological terms, from a tree absorbing carbon dioxide. It was maintaining its own existence by converting available resources into biological energy. The predator does not choose to be cruel. It does not relish the suffering of its prey. It does not experience guilt or exhilaration in the moment of the kill. It experiences whatever sensations drive it toward the behaviors that have been shaped by millions of years of natural selection. Hunger, perhaps, and the satisfaction of satiation. Nothing more. Projecting human moral categories onto these animals is not just scientifically incorrect. It is a failure of imagination, a refusal to see the natural world on its own terms, in all its complexity and strangeness, rather than through the narrow lens of human experience. And it does a disservice to the animals themselves, which deserve to be understood as what they were: extraordinary products of an evolutionary process that is among the most creative and complex phenomena in the known universe. Let us talk about scale one more time. Because scale is perhaps the most important concept in all of paleontology, and it is the one that is most consistently underestimated. We have discussed the temporal scale, the 97 million years that separate Giganotosaurus from us, the 30 million years that separate it from T-Rex. These numbers are staggering, but there is another kind of scale that we have not yet fully explored, the scale of biological diversity. In 97 million years of evolution since Giganotosaurus walked the Earth, the living world has been transformed beyond recognition. The number of species that have existed, diversified, and gone extinct in that time is incalculable. Every ecosystem, every habitat, every ecological niche on Earth has been occupied and reoccupied, again and again, by a succession of organisms, each adapted to the conditions of its own particular moment. The Cretaceous world of Giganotosaurus contained thousands of species, plants, animals, fungi, microbes, each one a product of its own evolutionary history, each one playing its own role in the ecosystem. The modern world contains millions of species, a diversity that dwarfs anything in the Cretaceous, at least in terms of the number of described species. And the fossil record, as rich as it is, preserves only a tiny fraction of the life that has ever existed, perhaps 1% or less of all the species that have lived on Earth. This means that for every Giganotosaurus we know about, there are thousands of animals, possibly millions, that lived, evolved, and went extinct without leaving any trace that we will ever find. The fossil record is an extraordinary gift, but it is a gift that gives us only the faintest outline of the true history of life. The vast majority of that history is lost forever, dissolved in time, decomposed, recycled, erased. This should inspire humility. Our knowledge of the past is fragmentary. Our reconstructions of ancient ecosystems are approximations. Our understanding of extinct animals is necessarily incomplete. The story we have told in this documentary, the story of Giganotosaurus, its anatomy, its behavior, its ecology, its evolutionary context, is the best story we can tell with the evidence available, but it is not the whole story. The whole story is far larger than we can encompass, and yet, the story we can tell is remarkable. The evidence we have is extraordinary. The methods we have developed to extract meaning from fossils, from rocks, from isotopes and microscopic bone structures are triumphs of human ingenuity. Every fact we have discussed in this documentary was unknown 100 years ago. Most of it was unknown 50 years ago. Some of it was unknown just a few decades ago. The science is young and it is advancing rapidly. What will we know in another 50 years? What new discoveries will be made? What new methods will be developed? What new questions will be asked and answered? We cannot know, but the direction of travel is clear, toward greater knowledge, greater understanding, greater appreciation of the extraordinary complexity and beauty of the history of life on Earth. Let us now consider the process of fossilization itself, a process that is far more selective and improbable than most people realize. The existence of any fossil, any preserved remnant of an organism that lived millions of years ago, is a kind of miracle. A triumph of circumstance over the overwhelming tendency of organic matter to decompose and return to the chemical cycles of the Earth. When an organism dies, the process of decomposition begins almost immediately. Bacteria, fungi, and scavengers begin breaking down the soft tissues, the skin, the muscles, the organs, the fat. In warm, moist environments, this process can reduce a large carcass to bare bones within a matter of weeks. In environments with scavengers, and the mid-Cretaceous landscape those, even the bones may be scattered, gnawed, and broken. For fossilization to occur, the bones must be buried quickly, before they are scattered, before they dissolve, before they are gnawed to fragments. The most common mechanism for rapid burial is sediment transport. The bones are covered by sand or mud, either through flooding, through the migration of a river channel, or through other sedimentary processes. Once buried, the bones are protected from mechanical disturbance and from the oxygen that drives aerobic decomposition. But burial is only the first step. Over millions of years, the buried bone must be permineralized, infiltrated by mineral-rich groundwater that gradually replaces the original organic molecules of the bone with stable mineral compounds. This process preserves the shape and internal structure of the bone with remarkable, but it takes a long time, thousands to millions of years, and it requires specific geochemical conditions. And then, after all of this, the fossil must be exposed again. The rock in which it is buried must be uplifted by tectonic forces, eroded by weather, and brought to the surface, all without destroying the fossil in the process. This final exposure is what makes fossils accessible to scientists, but it is also the point of greatest vulnerability. A fossil that has survived for 97 million years in the ground can be destroyed in a matter of years by erosion once it reaches the surface. This is why Rubain Dario Carolini's discovery in 1993 was so fortuitous. The bones of Giganotosaurus had survived for nearly 100 million years in the rock. They had been exposed at the surface, perhaps recently in geological terms, perhaps only a few thousand years ago. And a human being with a good eye and a passion for fossils happened to be walking through that particular stretch of Patagonian badlands at exactly the right moment, if he had not been there. If the erosion had continued for a few more years without a discoverer, if the bones had been fragmented by freeze-thaw cycles, dissolved by acidic rain, or simply overlooked by a lesson, the story of Giganotosaurus would still be out there in the rock. We would not be able to. Is the contingency is the history that has been preserved and discovered. And that history is a tiny fraction of the history that exists through a keyhole, and what we can see through that ordinary. But we must never forget how it in the darkness of deep time, unknown and noble. We are drawing now toward the conclusion, but before we arrive there is one more dimension of the Giganotosaurus story that we have not yet fully explored. It is a personal dimension, the one that brings the story of this ancient giant closest to our own experience of the world. It is the dimension of impermanence. Every living thing is temporary, every ecosystem is temporary, every geological formation is continent is temporary. In the fullness of geological time, nothing is permanent. Mountains rise and erode, oceans open and close, species evolve and go extinct. Continents drift across the face of the planet, colliding, splitting, rearranging themselves in configurations that would be unrecognizable to inhabitants of any previous era. Giganotosaurus was temporary. The ecosystem it inhabited was temporary. The floodplains of Cretaceous Patagonia, with their braided river channels, their Araucarian forests, their giant sauropod herds, and their blade-toothed apex predators, existed for a time, and then they changed beyond recognition. The rivers changed course. The climate shifted. The species that inhabited the landscape were replaced by other species. The floodplains dried or flooded or were folded up by tectonic forces into the mountains that now form the Andes. Nothing about that world was meant to last, and nothing did. It's remarkable. Even as the world of Giganotosaurus changed and was transformed and was eventually replaced, the matter of which it was composed did not disappear. The carbon that made up the bones of Giganotosaurus, the calcium in its bones, the iron in its blood, the phosphorus in its DNA, all of that matter cycled through the Earth system, again and again, taking on new forms, entering new organisms, playing new roles in new ecosystems across 97 million years. Some of the atoms that were once part of Giganotosaurus are now in the rocks of Patagonia. Some are in the ocean, dissolved in seawater. Some are in the atmosphere. Some are in the bodies of living organisms, trees, insects, birds, mammals, possibly even human beings. The matter persists, only the organization changes. This is a remarkable thought. The stuff of Giganotosaurus is still here. It has never gone anywhere. It has simply been reorganized, reconfigured, recycled through the endless cycles of the Earth system. The carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, into new forms, new combinations, new structures. Life is, in this sense, a temporary organization of matter, a way of arranging atoms into complex, self-maintaining, self-replicating structures that persist for a time and then dissolve, releasing their matter back into the system, where it can be reorganized into something new. Giganotosaurus was one such organization. So were the Argentinosaurus it hunted, and the conifers that fed the Argentinosaurus, and the microbes in the soil that broke down the dead vegetation and returned nutrients to the system. And so are we. Every human being is a temporary organization of matter that was once part of the Earth and will eventually return to the Earth and will be reorganized into something else. In this sense, we are not separate from the natural world. We are part of it. We are made of it. And the story of Giganotosaurus, this ancient, magnificent, temporary organization of atoms, is, in a very real sense, our story too. The science of paleontology does not stand still. Every year, new fossils are discovered, new techniques are developed, new analyses are performed, and our understanding of animals like Giganotosaurus continues to evolve, deepened and refined by each new discovery. In recent years, several new analytical techniques have been applied to Carcharodontosaurid fossils that have shed new light on their biology and ecology. One of the most exciting is the application of computed tomography, CT scanning, to fossil skulls. By passing X-rays through a fossil at multiple angles and using computer algorithms to reconstruct a three-dimensional image of the interior, scientists can visualize the internal anatomy of the skull, the structure of the braincase, the arrangement of the sinuses, the shape of the inner ear, without cutting into the fossil. CT scanning of Carcharodontosaurus skulls has revealed details of their sensory anatomy that were previously inaccessible. The structure of the semicircular canals of the inner ear, the organs responsible for detecting motion and maintaining balance, can tell us something about the agility and head movement patterns of the animal. The structure of the olfactory apparatus can give us insights into the importance of smell, and the geometry of the braincase can allow us to reconstruct the shape of the brain with a precision that was previously impossible. These analyses are ongoing. Each new CT scan of a Carcharodontosaurus skull adds to the picture, and each new addition to the picture makes the reconstruction of Giganotosaurus and its relatives more detailed, more nuanced, and more accurate. Another exciting development is the application of biomechanical modeling to extinct animals. Using the principles of engineering and biomechanics, scientists can build computer models of dinosaur skulls and bodies, and then simulate the stresses and strains that would have been generated during different behaviors, biting, running, turning, etc. These simulations can test hypotheses about hunting strategies, locomotion, and other aspects of behavior that cannot be directly observed in the fossil record. Biomechanical modeling of large theropod skulls has confirmed and refined many of the conclusions we have discussed in this documentary, particularly regarding the different biting strategies of Giganotosaurus and T-Rex. The models show clearly that the Giganotosaurus skull was optimized for a slashing, lateral bite, exactly what the tooth morphology and skull shape suggested. And they show that the T-Rex skull was optimized for a crushing, vertical bite, consistent with its bone-crushing feeding strategy. These are not just abstract academic exercises. They are a way of testing our hypotheses against the laws of physics, of ensuring that our reconstructions of extinct animals are not just anatomically plausible, but physically possible. Every time a biomechanical model produces results consistent with the anatomical evidence, our confidence in the reconstruction increases. And every time it produces unexpected results, we learn something new. There is a community of people whose work makes all of this possible, and it is larger and more diverse than you might. Yes, there are the professional paleontologists, the researchers in universities and museums who spend their careers studying fossils, writing scientific papers, and training the next generation of scientists. But there are also the field technicians, the people who do the physical work of excavating and preparing fossils, often in difficult and remote conditions. There are the museum curators who care for fossil collections and make them available to researchers. There are the illustrators and artists who reconstruct extinct animals in visual form, guided by the anatomical evidence but requiring vision and an understanding of living biology. And then there are the amateur enthusiasts, people like Ruben Dario Carolini, who discovered Giganotosaurus. Amateur fossil hunters have played an enormous role in the history of paleontology. Many of the most important dinosaur discoveries have been made not by professional scientists in organized expeditions, but by curious individuals, farmers, ranchers, construction workers, hikers, who happened to notice something unusual in the rock and had the knowledge and to the scientific community. This is one paleontology unique among the sciences. The objects of study are literally lying on the ground, in many cases, waiting to be found. You do not need a laboratory or a particle accelerator or a telescope array to discover a new species of dinosaur. You need patience, a good eye, a basic knowledge of what fossil bone looks like, and the ability to navigate remote landscapes. And if you find something extraordinary, the professional scientific community has the tools to extract the full scientific value from your discovery. This is not to minimize the role of professional scientists. Their training, their expertise, and their analytical capabilities are essential for making sense of fossil discoveries. But it is to say that science at its best is a collaborative enterprise, one in which many different kinds of people, with many different kinds of skills and backgrounds, contribute to the collective advancement of knowledge. Rodolfo Coria and Leonardo Salgado provided the scientific expertise to describe and interpret Giganotosaurus. But Ruben Dario Carolini provided the discovery. Without the amateur enthusiast walking through the Patagonian badlands with an observant eye and a curiosity about the rocks, the scientific expertise would have had nothing to work with. The fossil would still be in the ground, unknown and unknowing, waiting for someone to find it. This collaboration between the professional and the amateur, between the laboratory and the field, between the analyst and the discoverer, is one of the most beautiful aspects of the scientific enterprise. And it is a reminder that science is not the exclusive property of specialists. It belongs to everyone who looks at the world with questions and who is willing to follow the evidence wherever we are approaching the end of our journey. Let us return one final time to the Cretaceous floodplain. Return to that afternoon scene we visited at the end of the documentary. The Giganotosaurus at the forest edge, the sauropod herd on the open plain, the pterosaurs wheeling overhead, the crocodilian drifting in the river. But this time, let us hold the image for longer. Let us linger in it rather than rushing through it. We try to feel the weight of the moment, to appreciate what it means that this scene, so alien and yet so fundamentally similar to scenes we might witness in any modern ecosystem, actually happened. That these creatures actually existed. That this world, this specific configuration of landmasses and climate and organisms and ecological relationships was real. The Giganotosaurus moves. It has been watching the herd for an hour, and now it makes its decision. It begins its approach, slow, deliberate, measured. Its feet press into the soft ground of the floodplain. The late afternoon light catches the texture of its skin, the depth of its ribcage as it breathes, the slight movement of its tail as it balances the enormous weight of its skull and torso. The sauropod herd is 200 yards away. The Giganotosaurus covers the first 100 yards in 5 minutes, moving at a slow walk, using the scattered trees and the low ridges of the floodplain for cover. The herd has not yet noticed it. The adults are feeding, their long necks sweeping back and forth, stripping branches from the Araucarian trees. The juveniles are clustered together near the center of the herd, safe within the encircling wall of their elders' bodies. But there at the edge, a sub-adult, slightly smaller than the others, feeding alone on a stand of cycads a little distance from the main group. The Giganotosaurus focuses on it. The final 100 yards takes 2 minutes. The predator accelerates not to a sprint but to a trot, then a run. The ground shakes. The sub-adult sauropod raises its head, too late. The Giganotosaurus is already there, the massive jaws sweeping forward, the blade like teeth connecting with the flank of the prey animal. The strike is clean, the teeth slice through skin and muscle, blood flows, the sauropod screams, a deep, resonant sound that carries across the floodplain. The herd reacts, adults turning, moving toward the disturbance. The Giganotosaurus pulls back. It puts 30 yards between itself and the injured sauropod, and then it stops. It watches, it waits, it is patient, it has done what it needed to do. Now time will do the rest. This scene played out in some variation or another, countless millions of times over the course of the Giganotosaurus' existence. Each time the same fundamental dynamics, predator and prey, hunter and hunted, the transfer of energy from one body to another, the maintenance of the ecological balance. Each time a small piece of the grand story of life on Earth. And each time unseen by any observer, the deep forces of evolution were at work, selecting, refining, adjusting, pushing the lineage always in the direction of greater adaptation, greater precision, greater ecological efficiency. Every generation slightly different from the one before, every difference tested against the relentless standard of survival, every success incrementally recorded in the bodies of the animals that carried it. This is evolution. This is the process that produced Giganotosaurus. This is the process that produced Tyrannosaurus rex and the birds and the mammals and ultimately us. This is the process that has been running continuously on Earth for nearly 4 billion years, the most creative, most complex, most generative process in the known universe, and it has never stopped. It is running right now as you watch this. Every organism alive today is in the process of evolving, slowly, imperceptibly, but continuously. The world is changing and life is changing with it, finding new solutions to new challenges, exploring new regions of space. Giganotosaurus, the process that built it is not gone, the process continues. And who knows what it will produce given another 100 million years, what giants, what marvels, what extraordinary and unimaginable forms of life will inherit the Earth in the deep future, long after we are gone, we cannot know. Confident of one thing, they will be extraordinary, they will be perfectly adapted to their world. They will be the products of the same relentless, creative, indifferent, magnificent process that produced Giganotosaurus and everything else that has ever lived on this ancient, beautiful, improbable planet. Let us now offer some final reflections, not just on Giganotosaurus, but on what the story of this animal means for the way we understand our place in the world. We live in an age of rapid change. The world around us is being transformed at a pace that has no precedent in human history, by technological development, by shifts in the global climate, by the expansion and reorganization of ecosystems. It is is an age that can feel overwhelming, and in times of uncertainty we often look for guidance, for precedents, for patterns, for evidence that the challenges we face have been faced before and overcome. The story of Giganotosaurus offers no simple answers to modern challenges. It is not a parable, and it would be wrong to force it into that frame. Prehistoric animals do not teach us lessons in the way that human history does. They do not make moral choices. They do not triumph or fail in ways that are analogous to human triumph or failure. But the story of Giganotosaurus and the broader story of life on Earth that it represents does offer something. It offers perspective. It offers a sense of scale, and it offers a kind of wisdom that is not really about dinosaurs at all, but about the nature of existence itself. The perspective it offers is this: the world is far older and far more complex and far more creative than our brief human experience suggests. We have been here for such a tiny fraction of the Earth's history that we can barely begin to appreciate the depth and richness of what came before us. Giganotosaurus was part of a world that flourished for tens of millions of years, a world of extraordinary diversity and ecological complexity, built on the same fundamental principles that govern living systems today. It was not a primitive, imperfect version of it. It was its own world, complete and self-sufficient, beautiful in its own right. The sense of scale it offers is this: our problems, as real and as serious as they are small compared to the forces that have shaped this planet over geological time. Mass extinctions have happened before, climates have changed before, ecosystems have collapsed and rebuilt themselves before. Life has faced challenges of a magnitude that dwarfs anything in human experience, and it has survived. Not every species has survived. Ecosystem has survived. The process, the dynamic, the creative force has never been extinguished. It is bent, but it has not broken. And the wisdom it offers, if wisdom is the right word, is this: nothing lasts forever. Not the most powerful predator, not the most successful dynasty, not the most stable ecosystem. Everything is temporary in the perspective of deep time. Everything changes. And the appropriate response to this truth is not despair, but a kind of humility, an acceptance that we are not the culmination of the story of life, but one chapter among many, one turning of the wheel, one expression of the extraordinary creative force that has been building complexity, beauty, and diversity on this planet for nearly 4 billion years. Giganotosaurus ruled its world for millions of years, and then it was gone, and the world went on. And rulers, new wonders, new chapters in the endless story. And eventually it produced us curious, questioning, meaning-seeking creatures who look back into deep time and try to understand where we came from and what we are part of. We are part of this, all of this. The ancient floodplains and the giant sauropods and the blade-toothed predators and the great extinctions and the recoveries and the diversifications and all the endless, patient, creative work of evolution. We are the latest product of a process that is as old as life itself, and we carry within our bodies, in our DNA, in our metabolic chemistry, in the fundamental structure of our cells, the molecular legacy of every organism that has lived on Earth before us. We are made of stardust, yes, but we are also made of dinosaur, and the story of Giganotosaurus is, in a very real sense, our story. Giganotosaurus carolinii, the giant southern lizard. An animal that lived 97 million years ago in the warm, shifting floodplains of what is now Patagonia. An animal that reached lengths of up to 43 feet, weights of perhaps 8 tons. An animal whose 5.5-foot skull was armed with blade-like, serrated teeth, adapted to deliver devastating slashing strikes to the largest prey animals in the history of the Earth. An animal discovered by an amateur enthusiast on a windswept Patagonian hillside in 1993, described by 2 dedicated Argentine scientists in 1995, and too gradually, coming to occupy nerves in the public understanding of the history of life. This documentary has told its story as fully and as faithfully as the evidence allows. We have examined its anatomy and its ecology. We have walked through the landscape it inhabited. We have followed it on a hunt. We have placed it in its evolutionary context, the Carcharodontosaurus dynasty, the broader history of the theropods, the great sweep of the dinosaurian era. We have considered what its existence means for our understanding of evolution, of ecology, of the nature of life itself. And we have tried throughout to see it as it was, not through the distorting lens of human projection, not as a symbol of savagery or a challenge to the supremacy of T-Rex, but as a living animal perfectly adapted to its world, playing its role in the great ecological drama of the mid-Cretaceous with the precision and efficiency that 90 million years of evolutionary refinement had given it. There is much we do not know. There is much we may never know. The fragmentary and the distance in time is immense, but what we do know is extraordinary. and the ongoing work of paleontologists around the world in the field, in the laboratory, and at their computers continues to add to that knowledge year by year, discovery by discovery. The story of Giganotosaurus is not finished. New fossils will be found, new analyses will be performed, new questions will be asked, and new answers will be found. The picture will become richer, more detailed, more nuanced. And with each new addition, the giant southern lizard will become a little less forgotten, a little more real, a little more present in our collective understanding of the extraordinary history of life on Earth. Somewhere in the Badlands of Patagonia, right now, the wind is blowing across eroded sandstone ridges and mudstone slopes. The sun is beating down on rock that has been exposed by millions of years of weathering. And somewhere in that rock, perhaps just below the surface, perhaps already partially exposed by the last rainstorm, there is a bone. It might be a rib, it might be a vertebra, it might be a tooth or a claw or a fragment of skull. It might belong to Giganotosaurus. It might belong to a species we have not yet discovered, a Carcharodontosaurid we do not yet know, or a sauropod, or a smaller predator, or some other creature that shared the mid-Cretaceous landscape with the giant southern lizard. It has been there for nearly 100 million years, patient, enduring, waiting, and somewhere perhaps is walking through those badlands right now, looking at the rocks, noticing shapes and colors that are slightly different from the surrounding matrix, stopping, bending down, looking more closely. This is how the story continues. Not in laboratories or lecture halls, though it continues there too, but in the field, in the wind and the dust and the relentless Patagonian sun. In the hands of discoverers, professional and amateur alike, who understand that the rocks beneath their feet are not just rocks. They are archives, libraries, memory banks storing the accumulated history of life on Earth in the language of stone, and that language slowly, painstakingly, discovery by discovery, analysis by analysis, is being translated. The history is being read. And with every new translation, the world of Giganotosaurus becomes a little less distant, a little less alien, a little more real. This is the gift of paleontology. This is the gift of deep time, and this is the gift that Giganotosaurus carolini, the forgotten titan, the giant southern lizard of us who have taken the time to listen to its story. It lived, it hunted, it vanished. And it left behind its bones and its story and the profound reminder that every reign has its end, and every end is also a beginning, the beginning of the next chapter, the next turning of the wheel, the next exhaustible creativity of the wheel turns, the story continues, and the giant southern lizard, patient as stone, endures in the rock, waiting to be found. This has been the complete story of Giganotosaurus carolini, the forgotten Cretaceous world. From the discovery of its bones in the windswept badlands of Patagonia to the reconstruction of its life, its world, and its place in the grand sweep of evolutionary history, this is a story that belongs to all of us, a great book of life that continues to be written with each new discovery, each new analysis, and asked by curious minds reaching back into the deep past. The story of Giganotosaurus is the story of life, magnificent, temporary, perfectly adapted, and ultimately past, and so ancient that it humbles every attempt to fully come. We have tried in these 2 hours to do it justice. We hope we have succeeded in bringing this extraordinary animal a little closer to the attention and appreciation it deserves. Thank you for watching. Please share this documentary with anyone who might find it meaningful. And remember, the next great discovery may be just below the surface of the ground somewhere, waiting for the right person to find it. "97 million years ago, something enormous moved through a world we would barely recognize. It was not the creature you are thinking of right now. It was not the tyrant lizard king that has dominated our movies, our museums, and our imaginations for more than a century.